In the vast, unforgiving landscapes of 1870s Montana Territory, words were often seen as currency. The more you spoke, the more you were worth. But for Hannah, whose voice rarely rose above the rustling prairie grass, worth was measured in different ways, in careful stitches sewn with steady hands, in the language of herbs that healed without a single spoken instruction, in the quiet dignity with which she faced rejection and abandonment. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This is a story about how sometimes the softest voices carry the strongest spirits, and how one rugged, weather-worn settler named Caleb Thornton discovered that the woman everyone else overlooked would be the one to help him rebuild not just his homestead, but his faith in humanity itself. So settle in as we travel back to a time when the American frontier was still being written, when mail-order brides arrived on dusty stagecoaches with little more than hope in their luggage, and when one woman's journey from rejection to redemption would prove that true worth isn't measured by the loudness of your voice, but by the steadfastness of your heart. Spring clung to the hills of Millbrook, Connecticut, like a hesitant child, not quite ready to burst into full bloom, but no longer willing to surrender to winter's grip. In this small town where generations had lived and died within the same few square miles, Hannah Wilson moved through life as quietly as the morning mist that settled over the river at dawn. At 26, Hannah had long accepted her place in Millbrook's social hierarchy. Not at the bottom exactly, but certainly on the periphery, the spinster librarian's daughter who spoke so rarely that some townsfolk joked they wouldn't recognize her voice if they heard it. It wasn't that Hannah couldn't speak. She simply found that most times, others filled the silence before she found the courage to break it. Hannah's world was contained within the weathered walls of Millbrook Library, where her mother, Eleanor Wilson, had served as head librarian for 30 years. When Eleanor passed away the previous autumn after a lingering illness, everyone expected the library board would hire someone new, someone with presence and authority. Instead, to the surprise of many, they offered the position to Hannah, acknowledging what few bothered to notice, that she knew every book, every patron, and every system her mother had meticulously maintained for decades. The library was a modest, two-story brick building with tall windows that bathed the interior in golden light on clear days. Books lined every available wall, their leather spines worn smooth by generations of curious hands. It was here, among the whispered conversations and gentle rustle of turning pages, that Hannah felt most at home. Books didn't mind if you took your time finding your voice. They waited patiently, offering their stories without judgment or expectation. On this particular Tuesday morning in April 1876, Hannah moved between the shelves, returning volumes to their proper places. Her chestnut hair was pulled back in a simple bun, practical and unadorned. She wore a slate blue dress with a high collar and buttons down the front, one of 3 nearly identical dresses she rotated throughout the week. Hannah's appearance, like her demeanor, never called attention to itself, though anyone who took the time to look would notice eyes of unusual clarity, deep amber flecked with gold, observant and intelligent beneath long lashes. "Miss Wilson." Hannah turned to find Mrs. Abigail Palmer standing at the end of the row, her elaborate hat adorned with silk flowers that seemed to announce spring's arrival more definitively than nature itself. As the wife of Millbrook's most prominent banker and head of the Ladies' Auxiliary, Mrs. Palmer's visits to the library were infrequent and usually purposeful. "I hope I'm not disturbing your work," Mrs. Palmer continued, without waiting for Hannah to respond. "I've come to discuss the upcoming Founders' Day celebration. The committee was hoping you might allow us to use the library's reading room for our planning meetings. The church basement is being repaired, and frankly, Mrs. Whitmore's parlor is simply too cramped for comfort." Hannah nodded, her chin dipping in a small gesture of agreement. "Excellent," Mrs. Palmer said, interpreting Hannah's silence correctly. "We'll need it Thursday afternoons, beginning this week. I do hope you'll join us. Your mother always had such lovely ideas for the historical displays." Hannah's eyes widened slightly at the invitation. She opened her mouth to respond, but Mrs. Palmer was already turning away, her attention caught by the arrival of the town's young doctor. "Dr. Foster, just the man I wanted to see, my husband's. Cough has returned." Her voice trailed off as she swept the young physician into her orbit, leaving Hannah standing among the books, her unpracticed response fading before it could be voiced. This was how conversations typically went for Hannah. Brief, one-sided, and often concluded before she gathered courage to contribute. She didn't mind, not really. She had long ago accepted that she moved at a different pace than others, that her thoughts needed time to crystallize before she could share them aloud. Hannah returned to her shelving, fingers trailing along the embossed titles, finding comfort in their familiar textures. Her mother had understood Hannah's quiet nature and had never pushed her to be different. "Some people rush through life making noise," Eleanor would say, "while others take time to listen. The world needs both kinds, Hannah, though it doesn't. Always appreciate the latter." The afternoon passed in its usual rhythm. Elderly Mr. Hollister reading the newspaper by the west window, school children whispering over picture books in the corner, Mrs. Green exchanging her weekly novel with minimal commentary. Hannah moved among them like a shadow, anticipating needs before they were voiced, sliding a footstool near Mr. Hollister when his leg began to trouble him, steering the rowdier children toward the illustrated adventure tales that might hold their attention. At precisely 5 o'clock, Hannah locked the library doors and began her walk home. Millbrook's main street was lined with maple trees, just beginning to unfurl their spring leaves. She passed Harrison's general store, the post office, and Miller's bakery, where the scent of fresh bread followed her for several steps. People nodded as she passed, most offering perfunctory greetings that required no response beyond a polite smile. Hannah lived in the small cottage behind the library that had been provided to her mother as part of her position. It was a simple structure with faded blue shutters and a small garden, where Hannah tended herbs and vegetables, another skill inherited from her mother. Inside, the cottage was neat and sparsely furnished, with bookshelves the only feature that might be considered abundant. That evening, as Hannah prepared a simple supper of vegetable soup and bread, a knock at the door interrupted her routine. Few people visited the cottage. Most library business was conducted during operating hours in the building itself. She opened the door to find Reverend Thomas Blackwell standing on her porch, his kind face creased with concern beneath his silver hair. "Good evening, Hannah," he said, removing his hat. "I apologize for disturbing your supper, but I wanted to speak with you privately." He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "May I come in just for a moment?" Hannah stepped back, gesturing him inside with a small sweep of her hand. Reverend Blackwell had been a friend to both Hannah and her mother, one of the few people who seemed comfortable with Hannah's quiet ways and never rushed her to respond. Once seated at Hannah's small kitchen table, the Reverend declined her offer of tea and came directly to his point. "Hannah, I've known you since you were a little girl, hiding behind your mother's skirts at Sunday services. I've watched you grow into a capable, intelligent woman, though I fear too few in Millbrook recognize those qualities." He sighed, folding his weathered hands on the table. "I'm concerned about your future, my dear. With your mother gone, this position at the library is your only means of support, and I've heard troubling rumors from the town council." Hannah felt a chill pass through her that had nothing to do with the spring evening. She sat very still, waiting. They're considering bringing in a new librarian from Hartford, someone with more presence, as Councilman Porter put it. The Reverend's expression darkened with disapproval. "I argued your case, of course. No one knows this library or serves its patrons better than you. But Porter and his allies seem determined. They claim a town that hopes to grow needs. Well, someone more outgoing in such a public position. Hannah's hands trembled slightly in her lap, but her face remained composed. This news wasn't entirely unexpected. She'd noticed the whispered conversations that stopped when she approached, the evaluating glances from council members during their monthly inspections. "You have options, Hannah," Reverend Blackwell continued, his voice gentle. "I wouldn't presume to tell you what to do, but I want you to know that whatever you decide, you have my support." Hannah nodded, grateful for his kindness even as anxiety tightened around her chest, like a corset pulled too firmly. The Reverend reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a folded newspaper. "This may seem forward to me, but I thought you should see this. It arrived in today's mail." He smoothed the paper on the table, folding it to highlight a particular advertisement. "Established homesteaders in Montana Territory seek gentle, hard, working women of good character to share in building a prosperous future. Must be capable of managing household affairs and assisting with correspondence. Age 20-30 preferred. Railway passage provided upon agreement. References required and provided. Inquire J. Harrison, Postmaster, Millbrook, CT, Box 117. Hannah read the advertisement twice, her eyes lingering on the words gentle and correspondence. She looked up at Reverend Blackwell, a question in her eyes. "The man who placed this advertisement is Ezra Montgomery, from a settlement called Pine Creek near Helena," the Reverend explained. "James Harrison showed me the full letter. Mr. Montgomery is originally from Pennsylvania, educated, and has been homesteading for 5 years. By all accounts, he's built something substantial, a proper house, 160 acres under cultivation, even a small orchard beginning to bear fruit." Hannah remained silent, trying to absorb what the Reverend was suggesting. "You wouldn't be the first woman to seek a new start in the territories, Hannah. Many respectable women have found happiness as mail-order brides. Your skills, your literacy, your knowledge of books, your way with herbs and gardens, these would be invaluable to a frontier settler. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." He paused, watching her carefully. "And perhaps, in a place where people must rely on each other to survive, your quiet nature might be better appreciated." The silence stretched between them, but Reverend Blackwell, unlike most people in Hannah's life, seemed content to wait for her response. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft but clear. "You believe I should leave Millbrook?" It wasn't quite a question. The Reverend sighed. "I believe you should consider all paths before you. This library has been your whole world, Hannah. It was your mother's world too, and she served it well. But perhaps you were meant for something more, something different." After the Reverend left, Hannah sat alone at her table long after her soup had gone cold. The advertisement lay before her, its simple words offering a future she had never considered. Montana Territory seemed as distant and foreign as the moon, a wild place of mountains and prairies, of harsh winters and unfamiliar challenges. Yet what waited for her in Millbrook? A position soon to be lost, a cottage she would have to vacate, and the prospect of becoming truly dependent on the charity of others. Hannah had savings, but not enough to sustain her for long. Without family beyond her mother, her options were limited to seeking employment in one of the nearby mill towns, or perhaps becoming a companion to an elderly person, roles that would value her silent efficiency but offer little security. That night, Hannah stood before the small mirror in her bedroom, studying her reflection with unusual scrutiny. At 26, her face retained a youthful softness, though tiny lines had begun to form at the corners of her eyes, legacy of her habit of expressing with glances what others did with words. Her figure was slender but strong from years of carrying heavy books and tending her garden. Not beautiful, perhaps, but pleasant enough to look upon, or so her mother had always told her, But it wasn't her appearance that concerned potential employers or potential husbands. It was her silence, her hesitation, her inability to engage in the easy banter that seemed to come naturally to everyone else. Too shy, she whispered to her reflection, giving voice to the assessment she had overheard countless times throughout her life. Too quiet, too slow to speak. The words hung in the air of her small bedroom, accurate but somehow insufficient. Hannah was shy, yes, painfully so at times, but her silence contained multitudes, observations others missed, connections they failed to make, emotions too complex for casual conversation. Her quietness wasn't emptiness, it was fullness that struggled to find expression. For 3 days, Hannah carried the advertisement in her pocket, taking it out periodically to reread its straightforward offer. Each time she passed James Harrison at the post office or on the street, she felt his knowing gaze, aware that Reverend Blackwell would have informed him of their conversation. On Thursday afternoon, as the ladies' auxiliary gathered in the library's reading room, Hannah overheard fragments of conversation that solidified her decision. From Hartford Academy, with modern ideas about community engagement. Such a lovely speaking voice. So important for someone in her position. Committee votes next Tuesday, but it's all but decided. That evening, Hannah sat at her small desk and composed a letter more carefully and considered than any she had written before. She described herself honestly. Her experience with the library, her knowledge of books and plants, her housekeeping abilities. She mentioned her quiet nature directly, framing it as thoughtfulness rather than deficiency. She included a small daguerreotype that had been taken the previous year, showing her seated beside a shelf of books, her expression serious but not unwelcoming. Before she could reconsider, Hannah sealed the letter and walked to the post office, where James Harrison accepted it with a nod that contained neither judgment nor encouragement. The matter was out of her hands now, sent toward a future she could scarcely imagine. Ezra Montgomery's response arrived with surprising swiftness, suggesting either great efficiency or great eagerness. His letter was written in a strong, clear, hand-on quality paper, its contents direct but not unkind. Miss Wilson, I appreciate your prompt and forthright response to my advertisement. Your skills and experience appear well suited to the needs of my household and farm. Your references from Reverend Blackwell speak highly of your character and reliability. Life in Montana Territory is challenging, but rewarding for those with fortitude and patience. Pine Creek Settlement has grown to nearly 40 families, with a general store, small schoolhouse, and monthly church services. My property lies 2 miles from the settlement center, close enough for necessary commerce, but removed from immediate neighbors. If you find these conditions acceptable, I am prepared to send railway passage for your journey. I suggest departure in early May, when travel conditions improve and before summer heat makes the journey unnecessarily taxing. Please confirm your decision at your earliest convenience. If you accept, I will make arrangements to meet you at the Helena station upon your arrival. Respectfully, Ezra Montgomery. Enclosed with the letter was a bank draft sufficient for first-class passage from Connecticut to Montana, with additional funds for necessary expenses along the way. The generosity of this provision wasn't lost on Hannah, who recognized it as both practical consideration and statement of intent. What followed was a whirlwind of quiet preparation. Hannah gave notice at the library, enduring the barely concealed relief of certain board members and the genuine distress of patrons who had come to rely on her unobtrusive assistance. She sold what furniture wouldn't travel, packed her mother's china carefully among her clothes, and selected the books she couldn't bear to leave behind. Her mother's Illustrated Herbal, a volume of Wordsworth's poetry and the complete works of Shakespeare that had been her father's before his death in the war between the states. Reverend Blackwell arranged a small gathering after Sunday services as a farewell, where town residents offered awkward well wishes and practical gifts for her new life. Packets of seeds, sewing supplies, a sturdy pair of boots. Hannah accepted each with a nod and small smile, storing away their kindness alongside their relief at her departure. The night before her departure, Hannah sat alone in the nearly empty cottage, surrounded by her packed trunks and the echoing spaces where her life had been. Doubt crept in like the evening chill, wrapping around her with whispered questions. Was she making a terrible mistake? What did she really know about Ezra Montgomery beyond his careful penmanship and businesslike correspondence? What awaited her in the wild territory, thousands of miles from the only home she'd ever known? And the most persistent question of all: how could a woman too shy for Millbrook, Connecticut, possibly survive in the untamed frontier? As dawn broke on her final day in Millbrook, Hannah dressed in her traveling suit, a practical dark green wool that wouldn't show the dust of travel. She twisted her hair into its usual simple knot, secured her mother's cameo at her throat, and pulled on gloves that had been mended twice at the fingertips. James Harrison himself arrived with the wagon to transport Hannah and her trunks to the train station in Hartford. As they drove away from the cottage, Hannah turned for one last look at the library where generations of Wilsons had served. Its brick facade glowed amber in the morning light, solid and enduring as it had been before. Her birth and would remain long after her departure. "You'll write when you arrive safely?" James asked, breaking a silence that had stretched for several miles. Hannah nodded, then, realizing more was expected, added softly, "Yes. Thank you for your help, Mr. Harrison." The postmaster cleared his throat. "Montgomery seems a decent sort. From his correspondence, direct but decent. Reverend Blackwell did his inquiring about the man's character before suggesting this arrangement." Again, Hannah nodded, grateful for this reassurance, even as butterflies of anxiety fluttered in her stomach. At the Hartford station, James helped transfer her trunks to the porter's cart, then awkwardly patted her shoulder. "Godspeed, Miss Wilson. I expect Millbrook will seem a quieter place without you, despite appearances to the contrary." This unexpected kindness brought the threat of tears to Hannah's eyes. She blinked them away, offering a genuine smile to the postmaster who had served as an unexpected facilitator to her new life. As the train pulled away from the station, carrying Hannah toward a future as unknown as the territories themselves, she pressed her hand against the window glass, watching Connecticut's familiar landscapes recede into memory. Fear and hope battled within her chest, each claiming territory with every mile westward. Hannah Wilson was leaving the only home she had ever known, bound for a man she had never met, in a place she could scarcely imagine. Her shy nature had been deemed insufficient for a small Connecticut town. How would it serve her in the vast wilderness of Montana territory? The answer lay somewhere beyond the horizon, where a man named Ezra Montgomery awaited a bride whose worth remained to be determined. The rhythmic clanking of train wheels marked time as landscapes transformed outside Hannah Wilson's window. Connecticut's familiar rolling hills gave way to New York's bustling cities, then to Pennsylvania's industrial sprawl and Ohio's vast farmlands. With each passing day, civilization seemed to thin, buildings growing farther apart as nature reclaimed its dominance. Hannah kept a small journal of her observations, noting changes in terrain, vegetation, and the people who boarded and departed at various stops. She wrote in tiny, precise handwriting to conserve paper, filling margins with sketches of unusual plants or architectural details that caught her eye. This quiet documentation helped anchor her as everything familiar disappeared behind her. For someone who rarely left Millbrook, the journey itself was an education. Hannah had read about the expanding nation in books, but experiencing it firsthand, the vastness, the variety, the sheer scale of America stretching toward its western frontiers, overwhelmed. her senses. At night, lying in her berth listening to the train's movement, she felt both insignificant against such immensity and strangely liberated by it. The other passengers changed as the journey progressed. Well-dressed businessmen and families gave way to a harder sort, farmers seeking better land, young men with restless eyes, widows with determined expressions. By the time they reached Chicago, most passengers shared a quality Hannah recognized. They were people seeking reinvention, moving toward futures they would shape with their own hands. Hannah spoke little during the journey, responding to direct questions with soft-spoken politeness, but initiating no conversations. Yet she observed everything. The young mother soothing a fretful baby with remarkable patience, the elderly man who meticulously polished his boots each morning, the newlywed couple whose initial excitement had faded to tense whispers by Nebraska. In Omaha, Hannah changed to a smaller train that would take her toward Montana Territory. Her fellow passengers now were decidedly frontier-bound, men in practical denim and leather, women in sturdy cotton dresses without the elaborate bustles and trimmings of Eastern fashion. Conversation revolved around practical matters: crop, yields, weather patterns, Indian treaties, and territorial politics. During a stop in Wyoming, Hannah stood on the platform stretching her legs when she overheard a conversation between two men nearby, both with the weathered complexions of those who worked outdoors. "Another batch of mail-order brides heading west," the older man commented, nodding toward a group of women who had exited another car. "Fourth group I've seen this season." "Poor creatures," his companion replied. "Half of them will turn tail and run when they see what they're really in for. The other half will wish they had. Williams over in Bozeman got himself one last year. Pretty little thing from Boston. Found her crying in the chicken coop most mornings till winter set in. Come spring thaw she was gone. Left nothing but a note and took his good saddle." The men laughed, unaware of Hannah's presence or the way their words sent a chill through her despite the May sunshine. She studied the women they had indicated. 5 of them, ranging from perhaps 19 to 40, standing together but not speaking, each wearing an expression that mirrored Hannah's own mixture of determination and apprehension. Were they all traveling to meet unknown husbands? Had they all left behind lives that had somehow failed them? Hannah felt a kinship with these silent women, each carrying her own story toward an uncertain conclusion. That night, in her narrow berth, Hannah reread Ezra Montgomery's letter by lantern light, searching for reassurance between its straightforward lines. "Life in Montana Territory is challenging, but rewarding for those with fortitude and patience," he had written. Did she possess such qualities? Her mother would have said yes, but mothers were obligated to see the best in their children. The train pushed onward through territories increasingly wild and sparsely populated. Settlements grew smaller, farther apart, more tenuous in their hold upon the landscape. Mountains rose in the distance, their snow-capped peaks gleaming against the sky, beautiful and forbidding. At each stop, Hannah watched passengers disembark to waiting family members or wagons that would carry them to distant homesteads. Sometimes no one waited, and these solitary travelers squared their shoulders before walking toward town, their possessions creating uneven silhouettes against the western sky. On the final day of her journey, Hannah carefully dressed in her second-best dress, a dove grey cotton with small pearl buttons at the wrists and collar. She had saved her best dress, a navy blue wool, for her arrival, but today she would reach Helena, the territorial capital, where Ezra Montgomery would meet her tomorrow morning. The thought sent butterflies swirling through her stomach. Would he be disappointed when he saw her? The daguerreotype she had sent showed her clearly enough, but images couldn't capture movement, expression, the quality of one's presence. What if her shy nature, presented honestly in her letters, proved more problematic in person than he had anticipated. These questions plagued Hannah as the train made its final approach to Helena. Through the window, she could see a surprisingly substantial town spreading across a valley with mountains rising dramatically behind it. Buildings of wood and stone lined organized streets, suggesting a settlement aspiring to permanence and civilization despite its frontier location. When the train finally shuddered to a stop, Hannah remained seated while other passengers gathered their belongings and moved toward the exits. She needed a moment to compose herself, to gather courage for whatever awaited. "Last stop, miss," the conductor announced, pausing beside her seat. "Helena Station." Hannah nodded, rising on legs that feel unsteady after days of travel. She collected her small valise containing immediate necessities. The rest of her belongings would remain in the station's care until Ezra collected her the following morning, as arranged in their correspondence. The platform bustled with activity as Hannah descended from the train. Families reunited with embraces and exclamations. Porters wheeled carts loaded with trunks and crates, and drivers called out offers of transportation to various destinations. The noise and movement momentarily overwhelmed Hannah after days in the relative quiet of the train. "Miss Wilson, Hannah Wilson." Hannah turned toward the voice, confusion creasing her brow. No one was supposed to meet her today. Ezra's last wire had clearly stated he would come tomorrow, allowing her a night's rest at the station hotel before the final leg of her journey to Pine Creek. A woman approached, perhaps 50 years old, with steel-gray hair pinned neatly beneath a practical bonnet. Her dress, though plain, was well made, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to managing affairs. "I'm Martha Blackwood," the woman said, extending a gloved hand. "I believe you're expected by Ezra Montgomery." Hannah nodded, cautiously taking the offered hand. "Mr. Montgomery asked me to meet you," Martha explained, her voice brisk, but not unkind. "There's been a change of plans. He won't be coming to Helena." Hannah felt her heart sink. Had Ezra changed his mind? After traveling thousands of miles, would she be stranded here with no home to return to? Martha seemed to read these fears in Hannah's expression. "Not to worry, dear. Mr. Montgomery has simply been delayed by business matters. He's arranged for you to stay with me and my husband in Pine Creek until he returns." Relief washed through Hannah, followed quickly by a new anxiety. She had prepared herself to meet Ezra, had rehearsed initial greetings in her mind during endless train miles. Now she faced an entirely different situation, staying in a stranger's home in a settlement where she knew no one. "It's a half-day's journey to Pine Creek," Martha continued, seemingly untroubled by Hannah's silence. "We should collect your trunks and be on our way if we hope to arrive before dark. Samuel, that's my husband, is waiting with the wagon." Hannah followed Martha's efficient directions, answering the necessary questions about her luggage with nods or single words. Within 30 minutes, her trunks were loaded onto a sturdy wagon where a gray-haired man with kind eyes waited on the driver's bench. "Welcome to Montana Territory, Miss Wilson," Samuel Blackwood greeted her, tipping his hat. "I trust your journey wasn't too taxing." "Thank you, no," Hannah replied softly, allowing him to help her onto the bench seat. Martha climbed up beside her, creating a tight fit on the wooden seat designed for two. As the wagon pulled away from Helena's station, Hannah cast one last glance at the train that had carried her across a continent. Like a severed umbilical cord, her last connection to the east was being left behind. Whatever awaited her in Pine Creek, whether happiness or hardship, there would be no easy return. The journey to Pine Creek offered Hannah her first real glimpse of Montana's landscape up close. The wagon followed a well-worn trail that wound through rolling hills covered with prairie grasses rippling like ocean waves. Wildflowers dotted the expanse with splashes of color: purple lupine, orange paintbrush, yellow blanket flower. In the distance, mountains rose in jagged silhouette, their lower slopes dark with pine forests. "First time out west?" Samuel asked. "Handling the reins with practiced ease." Hannah nodded, her eyes wide as she took in the vast openness surrounding them. "Takes some getting used to," he acknowledged. "All this space. Some folks find it unsettling at first. Nowhere to hide, they say. Others find it freeing. Samuel and I came out from Pennsylvania 15 years ago," Martha added, "when Pine Creek was barely a name on a map. Now we've got nearly 50 families, a proper store, and even talk of a real church building instead of meeting in the schoolhouse. You'll stay with us until Ezra returns," Samuel explained. "Likely a week or two from what he said. Gone to Butte on business. Something about equipment for that ore crusher he's been planning." Hannah absorbed this information with growing confusion. Ore crusher? Ezra's letters had described him as a farmer, with orchards and cultivated fields. Had she misunderstood, or had he misrepresented himself? "Mr. Montgomery is a miner," she asked, her soft voice nearly lost beneath the wagon's creaking. Martha and Samuel exchanged a quick glance. "Ezra has interests in several ventures," Martha said carefully. "His farm is quite established, but he's also invested in some mining operations recently. Many settlers diversify their holdings when possible." This explanation did little to settle Hannah's unease. Her agreement had been with a farmer, a man who needed help with correspondence and household management. Mining was an entirely different prospect. Dangerous, uncertain, attracting a rougher element than agricultural communities. "Ezra Montgomery is well respected in Pine Creek," Samuel added, perhaps sensing her concern. "He serves on the town council and has been instrumental in bringing improvements to the settlement. A forward-thinking man." Hannah nodded, though questions multiplied in her mind. Had she traveled across the country under false pretenses? What else might differ from her expectations? As afternoon shadows lengthened, the wagon crested a hill to reveal Pine Creek spreading across a small valley below. Hannah's first impression was of a settlement still finding its form. A main street lined with wooden buildings in various stages of completion or weathering, surrounded by scattered homesteads stretching into the surrounding countryside. That creek, presumably the settlement's namesake, curved through the valley, its banks lined with the pine trees that had likely inspired the name. "Home sweet home," Samuel announced as they descended toward the settlement. "Not much to look at compared to eastern towns, but it's growing every year." Pine Creek consisted of one main street with perhaps 20 structures. A general store with Donovan's Mercantile painted across its false front, a small schoolhouse set back from the road, a blacksmith shop marked by the ring of hammer on anvil, and various businesses and homes interspersed between. No church spire rose above the rooftops, confirming Martha's comment about services being held in the school. People paused in their activities to watch the wagon pass, their gazes lingering on Hannah with undisguised curiosity. A mail-order bride's arrival was clearly notable news in a community this size. Hannah felt heat rise in her cheeks under their scrutiny, her natural shyness intensifying beneath so many watching eyes. The Blackwoods' home stood at the edge of town, a neat two-story structure of hewn logs with glass windows and a covered porch. A kitchen garden flourished alongside, and chickens pecked in a fenced yard. It wasn't grand, but it spoke of stability and care, of people who had established themselves firmly in this wilderness. "This will be your room," Martha said later, showing Hannah to a small but comfortable chamber on the second floor. "It's not fancy, but the mattress is clean, and the roof doesn't leak. Can't say that for every house in Pine Creek." The room contained a narrow bed with a colorful quilt, a pine dresser, a small table with a ceramic basin and pitcher, and a window overlooking the garden. Hannah's largest trunk had been brought up, while the others remained in the Blackwoods' storage shed until she moved to Ezra's home. "Supper's at 6, Martha informed her. "You have time to rest and freshen up. You must be exhausted after such a journey." Left alone, Hannah sank onto the bed, the events of the past weeks suddenly catching up with her. She had traveled farther than she had ever imagined possible, only to arrive and find the man she had come to marry mysteriously absent. The certainty she had carefully constructed through their correspondence now seemed built on shifting sand. Hannah moved to the window, drawing aside the simple muslin curtain to look out at Pine Creek. From this vantage point, she could see the settlement in its entirety, so much smaller than Millbrook, yet somehow more vital. People moved with purpose. Buildings rose from raw wilderness, gardens carved order from untamed earth. This was a place still becoming, its story still being written by those willing to endure its challenges. For better or worse, Hannah was now part of this unfolding narrative. She had left behind the library's quiet certainty for this frontier outpost, where nothing seemed guaranteed except change itself. Whether Ezra Montgomery proved to be the man his letters suggested remained to be seen, but Hannah had traversed a continent to discover the answer. At the Blackwoods' supper table that evening, Hannah observed the comfortable rhythm between Martha and Samuel, their conversation flowing around her minimal contributions with easy acceptance. They neither pressed her to speak nor seemed troubled by her quiet nature, a courtesy Hannah rarely experienced in Millbrook. "We've known Ezra since he arrived in Pine Creek 6 years ago," Samuel explained, as they ate a simple but satisfying meal of roast chicken, potatoes, and early spring greens. "Came from Pennsylvania originally, like us, though we never crossed. Our paths back east. His property is about 3 miles outside town," Martha added. "Good location, water access, decent soil, some timber. He's built it up considerably since arriving." Hannah listened attentively, gathering information about the man who would soon be her husband. Each detail added texture to the portrait formed. By his letters, a successful settler, respected by his community, established but ambitious. Yet something about his absence troubled her. What kind of man arranged for a bride's arrival, then wasn't present to receive her? "Does Mr. Montgomery travel often?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could reconsider. The Blackwoods exchanged another of those quick glances that suggested unspoken communication. "More recently," Samuel acknowledged, "the mining interests take him away periodically, but he's always been a man who sees opportunities others miss." "Opportunity is one thing," Martha said, a hint of disapproval coloring her tone. "But a man makes choices about his priorities." She turned to Hannah with a softer expression. "I'm sure he intended to be here for your arrival, dear. Sometimes circumstances interfere with even the best intentions." That night, as Hannah prepared for bed in the unfamiliar room, she wondered what circumstances had kept Ezra Montgomery from meeting his bride. Business opportunities, as the Blackwoods suggested? Or second thoughts about the arrangement they had made? Hannah brushed her hair with slow, thoughtful strokes, considering her situation. She was in a strange territory, housed with kind but unfamiliar people, awaiting a man who might or might not be as his letters portrayed him. The shy librarian's daughter from Connecticut had placed herself in circumstances that would challenge even the most adventurous spirit. Yet as she plaited her hair and climbed beneath the colorful quilt, Hannah felt a curious sense of anticipation alongside her anxiety. For the first time in her life, she was charting her own course, making decisions that would shape her future. Whether those decisions proved wise remained to be seen, but they were hers, not determined by her mother's position, the town council's judgment, or the limited options available to unmarried women in Millbrook. As sleep began to claim her, Hannah's last thoughts were of the vast landscape she had traveled through, its openness, its possibilities, its indifference to human concerns. In such a place, Perhaps even a woman too shy for a small Connecticut town might find room to become something more than others' expectations had allowed. Hannah's first week in Pine Creek passed in a curious mixture of waiting and discovery. Each morning she woke hoping for word of Ezra Montgomery's return. Each evening she retired with that hope deferred. The Blackwoods remained hospitable, incorporating her into their daily routine with unobtrusive kindness that made her increasingly grateful for their presence. Pine Creek, Hannah discovered, operated by its own rhythms, different from Millbrook's, orderly patterns, but no less purposeful. The settlement rose early, worked through the day's heat, and gathered for social interaction as evening cooled the air. Unlike the established social hierarchies of her Connecticut hometown, Pine Creek's community seemed determined by usefulness rather than heritage or wealth. Those who contributed necessary skills gained respect regardless of background. On her third day, Martha suggested Hannah might like to stretch her legs after so much travel. The older woman led her down Pine Creek's main street, providing introductions that served as Hannah's unofficial welcome to the community. "This is Hannah Wilson," Martha announced at each stop, her tone brooking no argument. "Ezra Montgomery's intended. She'll be staying with us until his return." Hannah endured these introductions with flushed cheeks, but growing appreciation for Martha's matter-of-fact approach. The older woman's straightforward manner eliminated the need for elaborate explanations and protected Hannah from the worst of the community's curiosity. At Donovan's Mercantile, a cavernous establishment smelling of coffee, leather, and fabric, Martha introduced Hannah to Patrick Donovan himself, a barrel-chested man with an impressive mustache and twinkling eyes. "Welcome to Pine Creek, Miss Wilson," he boomed, extending a hand across the counter. "Any friend of the Blackwoods is welcome here, and any intention of Ezra Montgomery is doubly so." Hannah shook his hand with a small nod, her usual response. To such greetings, Miss Wilson was the librarian in her Connecticut town, Martha supplied, understanding Hannah's discomfort with extended conversation. "Knows more about books than anyone in this territory, I'd wager." "Is that so?" Patrick's eyebrows rose with interest. "Well now, that's a fortuitous coincidence. Just received 3 crates of books last month. Donations from some ladies' society back east. Been sitting in my storeroom because nobody here knows how to organize them properly." Hannah looked up, genuine interest lighting her eyes. "Perhaps Miss Wilson might offer some guidance," Martha suggested smoothly, "while she's waiting for Ezra's return." By afternoon's end, Hannah had agreed to help establish Pine Creek's first lending library in a corner of Donovan's store. The project offered welcome distraction from her uncertain situation and allowed her to contribute a skill few in the settlement possessed. The following morning, Hannah returned to the Mercantile with a small notebook containing her initial plans. Patrick had cleared a space at the store's rear, where tall windows provided good light and custom-built shelves awaited books. "Nothing fancy like your libraries back east," he apologized, as Hannah examined the rough pine shelving, "but sturdy enough to hold whatever knowledge those crates contain." Hannah nodded appreciatively, running her fingers along the unvarnished wood. "Very suitable," she said softly. Patrick looked pleased at this minimal praise. Carpenter owed me for supplies, figured books deserved better than packing crates. The crates themselves sat unopened in the center of the space. Hannah knelt beside them, carefully prying loose the first lid with a tool Patrick provided. Inside, books of various sizes were packed tightly with straw to prevent damage during their long journey. Hannah lifted the first volume, a collection of Shakespeare's plays, its leather binding worn by many hands, and felt an unexpected surge of emotion. Here was something familiar amid so much strangeness, a connection to the world she had left behind. For the next 3 days, Hannah lost herself in the process of establishing Pine Creek's library. She categorized each book, created a simple, checkout system based on her experience in Millbrook and arranged the volumes according to subject and author. The work required little conversation but considerable thought, allowing Hannah to retreat into the familiar comfort of organizing knowledge while still contributing to her new community. Word spread quickly about the library lady organizing books at Donovan's. Children pressed their faces against the windows to watch her work. Women shopping for calico or coffee beans detoured to examine her progress. Even men with no particular interest in reading found excuses to wander to the store's back corner, curious about this quiet newcomer who handled books with such obvious reverence. Hannah remained focused on her task, acknowledging observers with brief nods but rarely engaging in extended conversation. Yet in this environment, her reticence seemed less problematic than it had in Millbrook. People watched her work with appreciation rather than frustration, valuing the result without demanding performative sociability. On the afternoon of her fifth day in Pine Creek, as Hannah was arranging the final shelf of newly categorized books, Martha Blackwood appeared at the library corner with uncharacteristic abruptness. "Hannah," she said, her normally composed expression troubled. "You should return to the house with me. There's news." Hannah's heart quickened. Has something happened to Ezra? Was her precarious situation about to change again? She followed Martha through Pine Creek's dusty main street, noticing how the older woman's usual measured pace had accelerated to something almost hurried. Neither spoke until they reached the Blackwood home, where Samuel waited on the porch, his expression as grave as his wife's. "Come inside, Miss Wilson," he said, holding the door. "We've had a word from Ezra." In the Blackwoods' tidy parlor, Hannah perched on the edge of a chair, hands clasped tightly in her lap. Whatever news had arrived, the Blackwoods' demeanor suggested it wasn't favorable. Samuel cleared his throat. "A telegram arrived from Butte this morning. Ezra sends his regrets, but his business there is taking longer than anticipated. He expects to return to Pine Creek in another week, perhaps 2. Hannah absorbed this information with outward calm, though disappointment twisted inside her. Another week or 2 of waiting, of existing in this limbo between her past and future. "There's more," Martha said, exchanging a look with her husband. "Ezra has asked us to prepare you for changes to his household situation." "Changes?" Hannah's voice emerged barely above a whisper. Samuel nodded soberly. "It seems Ezra has experienced some financial reversals. The mining venture he invested in hasn't produced as expected. He wants you to know that his circumstances are somewhat altered from what he described in his correspondence." "Altered how?" Hannah asked, her quiet voice steadier than she felt. "He didn't provide details," Samuel admitted. "Only that his current situation differs from previous representations, and that he would explain fully upon his return." The formal phrasing sounded like a direct quote from Ezra's telegram, legalistic, careful, revealing concerns beneath its measured words. Hannah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. "You should know," Martha added gently, "that there have been rumors about Ezra's investments for some time. Samuel and I didn't give them much credence. Ezra has always been ambitious but prudent, but this telegram suggests there may be some truth to the talk." Hannah looked between them, their concerned expressions confirming that this news was more significant than they were stating directly. "What sort of rumors?" Samuel sighed heavily. "That he's overextended himself, borrowed against his property, to invest in mining operations. Some say he's mortgaged everything on a gamble that hasn't paid off." The implications settled over Hannah like a weight. She had come to Montana Territory expecting to marry a prosperous farmer with an established homestead. Now it seemed she might be binding herself to a man facing financial ruin. "I understand if this changes your thinking," Martha said carefully. "No one would blame you for reconsidering the arrangement, given these circumstances. reconsidering. The word hung in the air, offering an exit from a commitment made under different pretenses. Hannah could break the engagement, perhaps return east if funds could be arranged. The library in Millbrook would be lost to her, but surely her skills could secure a position elsewhere. "Thank you for telling me," Hannah said finally, her voice soft but clear. "I'll need time to consider what this means." The Blackwoods nodded with obvious relief, perhaps having expected a more emotional response to such unsettling news. "You're welcome to stay with us while you decide," Samuel assured her. "Regardless of what Ezra's telegram suggests, we won't see you stranded." That evening after supper, Hannah walked alone in the Blackwoods garden, trying to unravel her tangled thoughts. The Montana sunset painted the sky in spectacular shades of gold and crimson, the beauty a stark contrast to her troubled mind. Ezra Montgomery had misrepresented his circumstances, whether deliberately or due to changing fortunes remained unclear. The stable future she had journeyed toward now seemed as insubstantial as the clouds turning purple against the darkening sky. Yet what alternatives existed? Returning east meant admitting failure, facing the quiet triumph of those who had predicted her inadequacy for frontier life. Staying meant marrying a man she had never met, whose character now seemed questionable given his apparent deception. Hannah's quiet footsteps traced the garden's edge as she considered the limited options before her. She had never been one for hasty decisions. Her careful nature required time to examine possibilities from all angles. But circumstances might not allow such luxury now. The following morning brought unexpected interruption to Hannah's deliberations. As she helped Martha with breakfast preparations, a commotion outside drew them both to the window. A wagon had pulled up before the house, not the Blackwoods' familiar vehicle, but a heavily loaded conveyance drawn by two dust-covered horses. A man jumped down from the driver's bench, his movements suggesting urgency. Samuel opened the front door before the visitor could knock. "Caleb Thornton," he greeted, surprise evident in his voice. "Didn't expect to see you in town for another month." "Morning, Sam," the man replied, his voice carrying a depth that matched his substantial frame. "Need to speak with you. Matter of some importance." Martha wiped her hands on her apron. "That's Caleb Thornton from Willow Creek Valley," she explained to Hannah. "Has the largest sheep operation in the territory. Only comes to town for supplies a few times a year." Hannah nodded, watching through the window as Samuel and the visitor conversed with increasing animation. The stranger, Caleb, gestured emphatically, while Samuel's expression grew increasingly troubled. After several minutes, both men entered the house. Hannah's first impression of Caleb Thornton was of contained power, tall and broad-shouldered, with a beard that partially obscured strong features weathered by outdoor life. His clothes were practical and worn, canvas trousers, a faded flannel shirt, sturdy boots caked with the red clay characteristic of the region. Nothing about him suggested refinement, yet he carried himself with undeniable dignity. "Martha," Samuel said, his tone unusually grave, "Caleb brings troubling news from Butte." The visitor removed his hat, revealing dark hair streaked with premature silver at the temples. His eyes, a startling clear blue against his sun-darkened skin, moved from Martha to Hannah with a questioning glance. "This is Hannah Wilson," Martha explained. "Ezra Montgomery's intended. She's staying with us until his return." Something flickered across Caleb's expression. Surprise followed quickly by what might have been a concern. He nodded acknowledgement to Hannah before turning back to Samuel. "As I was telling Sam," he said, his deep voice controlled despite obvious agitation, "I've just come from Butte. The Silver Summit mine has collapsed entirely. 3 men dead, several injured." Martha gasped, hand flying to her mouth. "How terrible! When did this happen?" 4 days ago, Caleb replied. "I was there delivering wool to the merchant when it happened. Whole towns in turmoil." Hannah listened with growing apprehension. Ezra was in Butte on a mining business. Was this the operation he had invested in? Ezra Montgomery, Samuel began hesitantly. Was he? That's why I came straight here, Caleb interrupted. Montgomery was one of the principal investors. He's been arrested. The words landed like physical blows. Hannah felt the blood drain from her face as she gripped the back of a chair for support. Arrested? Martha echoed in disbelief. On what charges? Caleb's expression darkened. Criminal negligence. According to miners I spoke with, Montgomery and his partners ignored repeated warnings about unsafe conditions, cut corners to increase profits. The support timbers that failed were substandard, barely half the thickness regulations require. Hannah's mind struggled to process this information. The man she had agreed to marry stood accused of negligence. That had cost lives. The financial reversals mentioned in his telegram suddenly took on more sinister significance. The territorial marshal took Montgomery and 2 other investors into custody. Caleb continued. They're being held pending formal charges. Given the deaths involved, I wouldn't expect release any time soon. Martha moved to Hannah's side, placing a supportive hand on her arm. You couldn't have known, she said softly. None of us suspected. Ezra capable of such disregard for safety? Hannah nodded mutely, her thoughts spinning too rapidly for words. She had journeyed across a continent to marry a man now revealed as not merely financially overextended, but potentially criminal in his business dealings. Caleb Thornton's piercing blue eyes rested on Hannah with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. Not pity exactly, but something more complex, an assessment tempered with empathy. Miss Wilson, he said, addressing her directly for the first time. I regret being the bearer of such news, especially given your circumstances. Hannah managed a small nod of acknowledgement, her usual silence now reinforced by shock. Caleb, Samuel said, you must be exhausted after such a journey. Stay for breakfast at least. The tall man hesitated, then nodded. Appreciate it, Sam. Been riding most of the night to bring word. Figured folks in Pine Creek should know what's happened, given Montgomery's standing here. As Martha hurried to set another place at the table, Hannah excused herself with a whispered word about freshening up. In the privacy of her room, she pressed, shaking hands against her face, trying to stem the tide of panic rising within her. Everything had collapsed as surely as the Silver Summit mine. Her future, tenuous from the beginning, now lay in ruins. She was stranded in a frontier territory, her intended husband imprisoned, her position more precarious than ever. Hannah moved to the window, seeking air that didn't seem to contain enough oxygen. Below in the yard, she could see Caleb Thornton, unhitching his horses, his movements efficient despite obvious fatigue. He worked with the quiet competence of a man accustomed to self-reliance, to solving problems through direct action rather than deliberation. How different from her own nature, Hannah thought. Her tendency to consider every angle before taking, even the smallest step. Yet what good had such caution brought her? She had researched, corresponded, prepared methodically for this new life, only to find herself caught in circumstances no amount of prudence could have anticipated. By the time Hannah descended to join the others for breakfast, she had regained her outward composure. The conversation around the table had moved to practical matters. How news of Ezra's arrest would affect Pine Creek, what might happen to his property, who else in the community might have invested in the failed mine. The territorial court moves. Slowly, Samuel was explaining as Hannah took her seat. Could be months before a trial. Meanwhile, Montgomery's assets might be frozen pending the outcome. What becomes of his property? Martha asked, passing a platter of biscuits to Caleb. The farm, the livestock? Depends on how it's titled, Caleb answered, nodding thanks for the food. If it's mortgaged, as rumored, the bank might claim it. If not, it remains his until legal judgment determines otherwise. Hannah listened silently, absorbing information that directly affected her future, yet seemed strangely distant, as though they discussed someone else's life rather than the one she had traveled so far to begin. "Miss Wilson," Caleb said suddenly, turning those disconcertingly direct blue eyes toward her, "may I ask what you intend now, given these developments?" The bluntness of the question startled Hannah. In Millbrook, such direct inquiry into personal matters would have been considered improper, especially from a stranger. But frontier directness, she was learning, operated by different rules. She began, then paused, gathering her thoughts. "I'm unsure. I need time to consider options." Caleb nodded, seemingly unsurprised by her abbreviated response. "Understandable. Not a situation anyone could have anticipated." "Hannah is welcome to stay with us as long as needed," Martha interjected firmly. "We won't see her abandoned due to Ezra's poor decisions." "Kind of you," Caleb acknowledged. "But winter comes early to these mountains. Decisions made now might determine whether someone thrives or merely survives when snow flies." The implied warning hung in the air, a reminder that in this territory, practical considerations often outweighed social niceties. Hannah felt the weight of approaching winter as another pressure-forcing decisions she wasn't prepared to make. "I have work at the library," she said softly, surprising herself with this assertion, "until other arrangements become clear." Something like approval flickered in Caleb's expression. "Work is always good medicine," he said, the corners of his eyes crinkling slightly. "Keep thinking clearly when trouble comes." After breakfast, as Caleb prepared to leave, Hannah overheard him speaking with Samuel on the porch, their voices carrying through the open window to where she helped Martha. "Clear the table. That's a woman caught in a bad situation not of her making," Caleb was saying, his deep voice pitched low but still audible. "Community should step up, not just leave her to the Blackwoods charity, good as it is." "What are you suggesting?" Samuel asked. "Don't rightly know yet," Caleb admitted. "But I'll think about it while I'm back at the ranch. Maybe by the next supply run, I'll have some ideas." Hannah moved away from the window, unsure whether to feel grateful for his concern or embarrassed at being discussed as a problem requiring solution. Either way, Caleb Thornton had complicated her already unsettled thoughts with his forthright manner and unexpected interest in her welfare. Later that morning, as Hannah walked to Donovan's to continue her library work, she noticed people gathering. In small groups along Pine Creek's main street, heads bent in urgent conversation. Word of Ezra Montgomery's arrest had clearly spread through the settlement, and Hannah felt curious gazes following her progress. Unlike Millbrook, where such gossip would have been conducted with pretense of discretion, Pine Creek's residents made little effort to disguise their interest. Several nodded acknowledgments as she passed, their expressions conveying a mixture of curiosity and sympathy. Hannah kept her eyes lowered, her steps purposeful, presenting the same composed exterior she had maintained through countless difficult situations in her former life. Inside Donovan's, Patrick greeted her with uncharacteristic gentleness. "Heard the news about Montgomery," he said, forgoing his usual boisterous welcome. "Terrible business. You're welcome to take the day if you're not feeling up to library work." Hannah shook her head. "I'd prefer to continue," she said softly. "The organization is nearly complete." Patrick nodded, seeming to understand her need for a familiar routine amid chaos. "As you wish. Some women from the settlement were asking when the library might open for borrowing. Seems you've created quite an interest." This small reminder that her work held value provided momentary comfort as Hannah retreated to the library corner. Surrounded by carefully arranged books, she could almost pretend that her life hadn't just been upended for the second time in as many months. Yet as she worked, labeling the spines with categories and checking her inventory list, Hannah's mind circled relentlessly around the brutal facts of her situation. She was alone in a frontier territory, Her intended husband imprisoned for negligence, resulting in deaths, her future more uncertain than ever before. And somewhere on the outskirts of this small community, a rugged sheep rancher named Caleb Thornton was thinking on her problem, a man whose direct gaze and forthright manner suggested he was unaccustomed to leaving difficult situations unresolved. The Pine Creek Lending Library officially opened 2 weeks after Hannah's arrival in Montana Territory. Despite the continuing uncertainty of her personal situation, she had thrown herself into completing the project, finding solace in the familiar routine of organizing knowledge. Patrick Donovan had announced the opening with a hand-painted sign in his store window, inviting all citizens with literary interests to attend the Saturday afternoon ceremony. Hannah had tried to dissuade him from making such a public occasion of it. A simple notice would suffice, she had suggested in her quiet way. Nonsense, Patrick had boomed, his enthusiasm undimmed by her reluctance. Pine Creek hasn't had anything to celebrate since the spring picnic got rained out. Besides, folks ought to recognize your contribution, especially now. The unspoken now hung between them, now that her intended husband sat in a Butte jail cell, now that her future in the territory had been cast into doubt, now that she had become an object of curiosity and speculation throughout the settlement. News of Ezra Montgomery's arrest had spread rapidly, details embellished with each retelling. By the end of the week, Hannah had overheard whispered accounts claiming Ezra had fled the scene, disguised as a miner, that he had bribed officials, that he had previous arrests under different names. She had no way to separate truth from fiction, and no desire to ask questions that would only fuel further gossip. Instead, she had immersed herself in completing the library. The original 3 crates of donated books had been supplemented by contributions from Pine Creek residents, well-thumbed novels, outdated school books, farmers' almanacs, even a collection of poetry in German donated by the blacksmith's immigrant wife. Hannah catalogued each one, creating a simple borrowing system that even children could navigate. On opening day, Hannah arrived at Donovan's an hour early, nervous energy propelling her through a final check of her meticulous arrangements. The books, nearly 200 in total, lined the custom shelves in orderly rows, their spines labeled with handwritten category markers. A small desk positioned near the shelves held the ledger where borrowers would record their selections. Hannah had even created a reading area with 2 mismatched but comfortable chairs, salvaged from Patrick's storeroom, and a small table between them. "You've worked miracles with that corner," Patrick said, appearing beside her. "Hard to believe it was just storage for old harnesses a month ago." Hannah acknowledged the compliment with a small nod. "The community contributed generously." "Well, they'll all be here soon to see what you've accomplished," Patrick replied, glancing toward the windows where shadows already indicated people gathering outside before the announced opening time. Panic fluttered in Hannah's chest at the thought of facing so many curious onlookers. In Millbrook, her mother had handled all public aspects of the library, while Hannah worked behind the scenes. Here, she would be the sole focus of attention. "Perhaps you could make any necessary announcements," she suggested, her voice barely audible. Patrick studied her for a moment, understanding dawning in his kind eyes. "Of course, I'll handle the speechifying. You just need to show folks how it all works." Relief washed through her as Martha and Samuel Blackwood arrived through the store's back entrance, providing familiar faces amid the anticipated crowd. "Everything looks wonderful, Hannah," Martha exclaimed, surveying the transformed corner. "What a gift you've given Pine Creek." Before Hannah could respond, Patrick unlocked the front door, and people began streaming into the store. Despite Pine Creek's small population, it seemed the entire settlement had turned out for the library's opening. Women in their best calico dresses, men with freshly trimmed beards, children scrubbed pink and cautioned to behave, all moved toward the library corner with undisguised curiosity. Hannah retreated slightly behind her desk as Patrick welcomed everyone with his characteristic enthusiasm, explaining the borrowing system Hannah had devised and praising her expertise. She kept her eyes lowered, uncomfortable with the attention, redirected her way until a movement at the store's entrance caught her notice. Caleb Thornton stood in the doorway, his imposing frame filling the space. Unlike the other attendees in their Sunday best, he wore the same practical work clothes Hannah had seen during his previous visit, though perhaps a cleaner version. He removed his hat as he entered, revealing that dark hair with its striking silver streaks at the temples. His gaze swept the room before settling on Hannah with an intensity that made her glance away quickly. She hadn't expected him to return to Pine Creek so soon. According to Samuel, Caleb's sheep ranch in Willow Creek Valley was a substantial operation that required constant attention, especially with lambing season approaching. His presence at such a minor community event seemed curious. Patrick concluded his introduction and invited everyone to examine the books and register as borrowers. The crowd dispersed throughout the library corner, exclaiming over titles and asking questions that Hannah answered with quiet precision. She demonstrated the borrowing ledger to an enthusiastic group of schoolchildren, showed the minister's wife where religious texts were shelved, and helped an elderly man find a volume on fruit tree cultivation. Throughout it all, she was acutely aware of Caleb Thornton's presence. He hadn't approached the desk or selected any books, instead engaging in conversation with Samuel Blackwood near the store's entrance. Occasionally, she would glance up to find his clear blue eyes observing her, his expression thoughtful beneath his beard. By late afternoon, the initial excitement had ebbed. Most families had selected books and departed, leaving only a few browsers, examining shelves at leisure. Hannah sat at her desk, recording the day's borrowings in her master ledger, when a shadow fell across her work. She looked up to find Caleb standing before her, hat in hand. "Miss Wilson," he greeted, his deep voice pitched low. "Quite an accomplishment you've created here." Hannah nodded acknowledgement, uncertain how to respond to this unexpected praise. "I'm not much for reading myself," he continued, glancing around at the shelves. "Never had time for it, between keeping sheep alive and the ranch running. But I respect those who value knowledge." He seemed to be waiting for a response, so Hannah gathered her courage. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Thornton. Did you wish to borrow a book?" A slight smile appeared beneath his beard, crinkling the corners of his eyes. "Not today. Actually, I came to Pine Creek specifically to speak with you." This direct statement caught Hannah off guard. "With me?" "Yes." Caleb glanced around at the few remaining patrons, then back to Hannah. "Not here, though. Too many interested. Ears. Might I call at the Blackwoods this evening? With your permission, of course." Hannah's mind raced with possibilities. What could this man, practically a stranger, possibly want to discuss with her? Yet his manner suggested serious intent rather than idle curiosity. "Yes," she found herself saying, the word emerging before she had fully considered it. "After. Supper would be acceptable." Caleb nodded, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. "I'll be there at 7 then." "Thank you, Miss Wilson." He replaced his hat and departed with long strides, leaving Hannah to wonder what proposition could possibly bring a solitary sheep rancher to seek private conversation with an abandoned mail-order bride. The remainder of the afternoon passed in a blur of activity as Hannah completed the library's first day of operation. By the time she returned to the Blackwoods' home, the sun was already slipping behind the western mountains, painting the valley in golden light, rapidly fading to purple shadows. "Caleb Thornton asked to call this evening," Hannah informed Martha as she helped prepare supper. "He said he wishes to speak with me." Martha's hands paused in their work of kneading bread dough. "Did he indeed? How interesting. Do you know what he might want?" Hannah asked, slicing potatoes with careful precision. Martha resumed her kneading, though her expression had grown thoughtful. I couldn't say for certain. Caleb keeps his own counsel most times, but he's a man who doesn't act without purpose. This cryptic response did little to ease Hannah's curiosity or apprehension. By the time 7 o'clock approached, she had changed into her second-best dress, the dove grey with pearl buttons, and pinned her hair more neatly, telling herself these preparations were simple courtesy rather than any particular concern for Caleb Thornton's impression of her. Precisely at 7, a knock sounded at the Blackwoods' front door. Samuel admitted Caleb, who had also made concessions to the occasion, wearing a clean flannel shirt and what appeared to be newly brushed trousers. His beard had been trimmed, accentuating the strong line of his jaw. "Evening, Thornton," Samuel greeted. "Right on time, as usual." "Sam." "Mrs. Blackwood." Caleb nodded to each before his gaze found Hannah, who had remained partially hidden in the shadows of the parlor. "Miss Wilson, thank you for agreeing to speak with me." Martha smoothly took control of the situation. "You'll take coffee in the parlor? I've just made a fresh pot." "Much appreciated," Caleb replied, following their hostess into the room where Hannah stood. The Blackwoods' parlor was modestly furnished but comfortable, with a horsehair sofa, 2 armchairs, and a small table bearing a kerosene lamp that cast a warm glow over the assembled company. Hannah perched on the edge of the sofa, while Caleb took one of the armchairs opposite her. Martha served coffee from a chipped but serviceable pot, then seated herself beside Hannah, clearly intending to remain for the conversation. "Now then," she said once everyone was settled, "what brings you back to Pine Creek so soon, Caleb? Thought you'd be busy with spring lambing." "Got my foreman handling things for a day or two," he replied, cradling his coffee cup in large, work-roughened hands. "Had some thinking to do after my last visit about Miss Wilson's situation." Hannah felt heat rise in her cheeks at being discussed so directly, though she kept her expression composed. "The Montgomery business is unfortunate, certainly," Samuel agreed from his position near the fireplace. "But Miss Wilson has a home with us for as long as needed." "Your generosity does you credit," Caleb acknowledged, "but winter's coming, and charity, even the kindest sort, has its limits." An uncomfortable silence followed this blunt assessment. Hannah studied her coffee, avoiding the gazes she could feel directed her way. "I've got a proposition," Caleb continued, his deep voice steady, "for Miss Wilson to consider. A solution of sorts, perhaps." Hannah looked up then, meeting his clear blue eyes directly for the first time that evening. "What sort of proposition?" "Mr. Thornton," Caleb set his coffee cup on the small table beside him, leaning forward slightly, his expression serious beneath his neatly trimmed beard. "My ranch needs a housekeeper," he stated simply. "Someone to manage the domestic side of things while I handle the livestock and land. Cooking, cleaning, mending, the usual household work. It's a fair-sized place, 4 bedrooms in the main house, with a proper kitchen and root cellar. Not fancy, but solid." Hannah blinked, trying to process this unexpected offer. A position as housekeeper hadn't been among the possibilities she had considered when contemplating her future. "It would be a paid position," Caleb continued, seeming to interpret her silence as hesitation. "Room and board, plus wages, $15 monthly, which is 3 more than the hotel in Helena pays its housekeeper. You'd have your own quarters. Small, but private. Sundays free, unless weather or emergency demands otherwise." The terms were surprisingly generous. In Millbrook, such domestic positions typically offered far less compensation and rarely included private accommodations. Still, Hannah's mind is filled with practical questions. "Your ranch, how far is it from Pine Creek?" she asked softly. "About 20 miles northwest in Willow Creek Valley," Caleb replied. "Good water, sheltered location. I make trips to Pine Creek for supplies every few weeks. You wouldn't be completely isolated from town." 20 miles. far enough that visits to the library she had just established would be infrequent at best. Yet what claim did she really have on that project? It had merely been a way to fill uncertain days while awaiting news of Ezra. "I should mention," Caleb added, "I'm rarely in the house except evenings and during bad weather. My work keeps me outdoors from dawn till dusk most days. You'd have considerable independence in managing household affairs." Martha, who had remained uncharacteristically silent during this exchange, finally spoke. "It's a considerable change from what you traveled west expecting, Hannah, from wife to housekeeper." The blunt assessment hung in the air, acknowledging what everyone present understood, that Hannah's circumstances had been dramatically altered by Ezra Montgomery's arrest, transforming her from prospective bride to woman in need of employment. "True," Caleb conceded, his gaze still fixed on Hannah, "but it offers independence, honest work, and time to consider longer-term decisions. Miss Wilson wouldn't be obligated to remain beyond winter if other opportunities arose." Hannah's thoughts whirled with competing considerations. The position offered a practical solution to her immediate dilemma, providing shelter, income, and purpose while she determined her next steps. Yet it also meant leaving the small community where she had just begun establishing connections, exchanging the Blackwoods' warm household for that of a virtual stranger. "I'd need to know more," she said finally, her quiet voice steady despite her inner uncertainty. "About the work expected, the house itself, the area." Something like approval flickered in Caleb's expression. "Of course. I've prepared a written description if you'd care to review it." He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a folded paper, handing it to Hannah. The document proved more detailed than she had anticipated. A carefully written account of the ranch's location, the house and its amenities, the specific duties expected, and the terms of employment. The handwriting was surprisingly neat for a man whose hands bore the calluses of hard physical labor. The terms clearly stated without flowery language or vague promises. "You've given this considerable thought," Samuel observed, peering over Hannah's shoulder at the document. "I don't make offers lightly," Caleb replied, "and I recognize it's a significant decision for Miss Wilson. She should have all the facts before considering it." Hannah read through the document twice, noting details that revealed more about Caleb Thornton than perhaps he realized. The house contained a small library of its own, mentioned matter-of-factly among amenities. The housekeeper would have authority to order household supplies according to her judgment. Most tellingly, the final paragraph acknowledged that Miss Wilson's expertise with books and organization might be applied to ranch records and correspondence as time permits. He had observed her closely during their brief acquaintance, recognizing skills beyond housekeeping that might prove valuable. This perceptiveness surprised her, as did the respect it implied for abilities often overlooked in Millbrook. "When would you need an answer?" Hannah asked, carefully refolding the paper. "I'll remain in Pine Creek through tomorrow," Caleb said, planning to depart the following morning. "But there's no pressure, Miss Wilson. If you need more time, I understand. The position will remain open until filled." This courtesy, extending consideration without urgency, further complicated Hannah's impression of the man before her. His blunt manner suggested impatience, yet his actions demonstrated unexpected sensitivity to her situation. "I'll consider it carefully," she promised, meeting his gaze again, "and let you know tomorrow." Caleb nodded, apparently satisfied with this response. The conversation shifted to general topics: weather prospects, livestock prices, territorial news, but Hannah remained mostly silent, her thoughts focused on the decision before her. After Caleb departed, the Blackwoods were careful not to pressure Hannah with their opinions, though Martha did observe that Caleb Thornton has a reputation as a fair employer, if somewhat reserved in his dealings. That night, Hannah lay awake in her borrowed bed, Caleb's written offer on the nightstand beside her. The rational course seemed clear enough. Accept the position, which offered financial independence and breathing space to consider long-term options, yet something held her back from immediate acceptance. Perhaps it was the memory of her last major decision, to become Ezra Montgomery's mail-order bride, which had led to her current predicament. Or perhaps it was uncertainty about Caleb himself, a man who lived largely apart from the community, whose piercing blue eyes seemed to observe more than was comfortable, whose direct manner contrasted so sharply with the social niceties Hannah had been raised to expect. By morning, Hannah had made her decision. After breakfast, she asked Samuel if he knew where Caleb was staying in Pine Creek. "At Jensen's boarding house," he replied. "Want me to take a message?" Hannah shook her head. "I'll go myself. Better to speak directly." Martha looked surprised but pleased by this uncharacteristic assertiveness. "Would you like me to accompany you?" "Thank you. No," Hannah said softly. "This is my decision to convey." The walk to Jensen's boarding house took Hannah past Donovan's Mercantile, where several patrons greeted her with newfound respect following the library's successful opening. Their acknowledgments bolstered her confidence as she approached the modest two-story building where travelers found temporary lodging in Pine Creek. Mrs. Jensen, a stout woman with a perpetually harried expression, directed Hannah to the establishment's small sitting room. "Mr. Thornton's having breakfast," she explained. "I'll tell him you're here." The sitting room was simply furnished with mismatched chairs and a scarred table bearing month-old newspapers from Helena. Hannah stood near the window, gathering her thoughts, when Caleb entered the room. He wore the same practical clothes as the previous evening, though his hair was slightly damp, suggesting he had recently washed. "Miss Wilson," he greeted, genuine surprise evident in his voice. "Didn't expect to see you so early." "I've considered your offer," Hannah said, forcing herself to meet his gaze despite her natural inclination to look away. "And I have questions." Before giving my answer, something that might have been approval flickered in Caleb's expression. "Of course. Please, sit." They took seats across from each other at the small table, its surface marked by water rings and ink stains from previous occupants. Hannah folded her hands in her lap to steady them before speaking. "Your ranch, are there other workers besides yourself?" she asked. "My foreman, Jim Parker, lives in a cabin about quarter-mile from the main house," Caleb replied. "During busy seasons, lambing, shearing, moving flocks to summer pasture, I hire additional hands who bunk in the outbuilding. But they take meals separately, not in the main house." Hannah nodded, absorbing this information. "And the nearest neighbors?" "Carson family, about 3 miles east. 5 young children, the oldest just turned 12. Beyond them, Taylor brothers, another 2 miles. Not close, but near enough if an emergency arose." The isolation was greater than Hannah had anticipated, yet not complete. Still, it represented a significant change from both Millbrook's closely arranged community and Pine Creek's small but established settlement. "One more question," Hannah said, gathering courage for what mattered most. "Why me, Mr. Thornton? Surely there are women in Helena or even Pine Creek who need employment and have more experience with ranching life." Caleb's expression grew thoughtful, his blue eyes studying her with that directness she found both unsettling and strangely reassuring. "3 reasons," he said finally. "First, practical. You need a position. My ranch needs a housekeeper. Simple exchange of needs. Second, your organization skills. Saw what you did with that library. Ranch records are a mess. Accounts, breeding, records, supply inventories. Could use that same ordering touch." He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. "And third," Hannah prompted quietly when the silence extended. "You're careful," Caleb said, surprising her. "Thoughtful, not hasty in judgment or action. Valuable trait in my experience, especially in Montana territory, where mistakes can prove costly. Watch how you handled the Montgomery situation. No hysterics, no rash decisions. Just quiet consideration of options. Ranch life rewards that approach. Hannah hadn't expected such perceptive assessment from this rugged man who seemed more at home with sheep than people. That he had noticed qualities in her often dismissed as simple shyness in Millbrook struck her forcefully. "I see," she said softly. "So," Caleb prompted after another moment of silence. "Your decision?" Hannah met his gaze directly. "I accept your offer, Mr. Thornton, on the terms outlined in your document, through winter as specified, with the understanding that either party may terminate the arrangement with 2 weeks' notice." Relief and something like satisfaction crossed Caleb's features. "Good, thank you, Miss Wilson. We'll depart the day after tomorrow, if that allows sufficient time to settle your affairs here." "It does," Hannah confirmed, already mentally cataloguing what needed to be arranged, transferring library responsibilities, packing her belongings, saying goodbyes to the Blackwoods and others who had shown her kindness. "One more thing," Caleb added as they both stood. "Ranch is my domain, but the household will be yours to manage. Your experience may differ from mine on domestic matters. I'll respect that expertise if you'll grant the same courtesy regarding ranch operations." This unexpected acknowledgement of her authority within her sphere further complicated Hannah's impression of Caleb Thornton. The man who stood before her, with his weathered face and work-hardened hands, defied easy categorization, direct, yet considerate, solitary yet observant of others, outwardly rough yet unexpectedly perceptive. "Agreed," Hannah said, offering her hand to seal their arrangement. Caleb's large hand enveloped hers briefly, the calluses on his palm testifying to years of physical labor. The contract between them was simple yet significant, a practical solution to mutual needs that would take Hannah Wilson from Pine Creek's small community to the isolated Willow Creek Valley, from abandoned bride to independent housekeeper, from a future once imagined with Ezra Montgomery to one shaped by her own decisions. What awaited her at Thornton Ranch remained to be seen, but as Hannah walked back to the Blackwoods to share her news, she felt an unexpected lightness in her step. For perhaps the first time since leaving Connecticut, her path forward had been chosen by her own judgment rather than external circumstances or others' expectations. The journey to Thornton Ranch began at dawn 2 days later. Hannah stood on the Blackwoods porch as Caleb loaded her trunks onto his wagon, the eastern sky painted in delicate shades of pink and gold. Martha pressed a small package into her hands, bread and cheese for the journey, along with a jar of preserved peaches. 20 miles isn't the end of the earth," Martha said, her brisk tone belied by the concern in her eyes. "But it's far enough when you don't know what awaits you." "I'll be fine," Hannah assured her, the words coming more easily than they might have weeks earlier. Her time in Pine Creek had taught her resilience she hadn't known she possessed. Samuel shook Caleb's hand firmly. "You'll bring Miss Wilson to town occasionally, for supplies and such?" "Whenever weather permits," Caleb confirmed, "and she's welcome to correspond through Donovan's mail service." These small concessions to Hannah's continued connection with Pine Creek had been negotiated the previous day, evidence of the Blackwoods' protective concern for her welfare. Hannah had been touched by their advocacy, though she suspected Caleb would have offered these considerations regardless. Final goodbyes exchanged, Hannah climbed onto the wagon seat beside Caleb. The bench was narrower than the one she had shared, with Martha and Samuel upon her arrival in Pine Creek, forcing a proximity to Caleb that made her acutely aware of his physical presence, the breadth of his shoulders, the faint scent of soap and leather that accompanied him. "Ready?" he asked, gathering the reins. Hannah nodded, not trusting her voice in that moment, though her decision to accept this position remained rational, leaving the small security she had established in Pine Creek for the unknown terrain of Thornton Ranch stirred her natural caution. The wagon pulled away from the Blackwoods' home, rolling down Pine Creek's main street, where early risers paused in their activities to watch its passage. Hannah glimpsed Patrick Donovan sweeping the boardwalk in front of his store, Mrs. Jensen hanging laundry behind the boarding house, the blacksmith already at work, sparks flying from his forge. These people had become unexpectedly familiar during her brief stay, not friends exactly, but known quantities in a landscape of uncertainty. As the settlement receded behind them, Caleb guided the wagon onto a less-traveled road heading northwest. Unlike the route from Helena, which showed regular use by multiple conveyances, this trail bore the marks of occasional traffic, rutted in places, overgrown in others, following the natural contours of the land rather than any surveyor's plan. "Not much occasion for visitors out our way," Caleb explained, noticing Hannah's observation of the trail's condition. "Mostly just my supply runs, and the occasional neighbor heading to town." The terrain grew increasingly dramatic as they traveled, with rolling hills giving way to steeper elevations. Pine forests blanketed the higher slopes, while meadows filled, with spring wildflowers spread across the valley floor. A creek, presumably the willow-lined waterway that gave the valley its name, meandered alongside their route for several miles before curving away toward distant mountains. Hannah took mental notes of landmarks as they traveled: an unusual rock formation, a lightning-struck tree, a place where the creek narrowed dramatically between rocky banks. If circumstances ever required her to find her way alone between ranch and settlement, such details might prove essential. As the morning progressed, Caleb maintained a companionable silence that Hannah found surprisingly comfortable. Unlike most people she had encountered, he seemed to feel no compulsion to fill quiet moments with unnecessary conversation. Occasionally, he would point out a feature of interest: a hawk's nest high in a pine, tracks suggesting recent deer passage, or the distant outline of a neighboring homestead, but otherwise allowed the journey to unfold without forced interaction. Around midday, he stopped the wagon in a small clearing beside the creek. "Need to rest the horses," he explained, setting the brake. "Good place for a meal if you're hungry." They ate the provisions Martha had packed, seated on rocks near the water's edge. The creek burbled pleasantly over stones, its clear water catching sunlight in flashes of silver. In the distance, sheep grazed on a hillside, white dots against the green spring grass. "Your flock?" Hannah asked, nodding toward the distant animals. Caleb nodded. "One of them. Keep about 2,000 head total, divided between different pastures. Those belong to the South Range group." The number surprised Hannah. She had understood Thornton Ranch was substantial, but 2,000 sheep represented a significant operation, far larger than any farm in Millbrook's vicinity. "Do you manage all this alone?" she asked, genuinely curious about the enterprise she was joining, however peripherally. "Jim Parker's been my foreman for 6 years, Caleb replied. "Good man, knows sheep better than most. Then seasonal hands, usually. 4 extra during lambing and shearing. Used to be harder before fencing, when we needed more men for constant herding." As they resumed their journey, Caleb proved more forthcoming about the ranch operations, perhaps encouraged by Hannah's questions. She learned that he had established the ranch 8 years earlier, starting with just 200 sheep purchased from a failing operation near Helena. Through careful breeding, strategic land acquisition, and reinvestment of profits, he had built one of the territory's most successful sheep operations. "Cattle's more common in these parts," he explained, "but sheep do better in our higher elevations, need less water, and produce 2 harvests, wool and meat. Smarter business if you're willing to learn their ways." The afternoon brought them deeper into Willow Creek Valley. the trail gradually ascending as they approached their destination. Around a final bend, Thornton Ranch came into view, nestled in a protected hollow where surrounding hills created a natural windbreak. Hannah's first impression was of unexpected order amid wilderness. The main house, a substantial two-story structure of squared logs with a covered porch across its front, anchored a carefully arranged collection of outbuildings. A large barn stood nearby, its red paint weathered but intact. Several smaller structures, bunkhouse, smokehouse, equipment sheds, formed a rough semicircle around a central yard. Beyond these, fenced pastures stretched toward distant hills, while a productive garden occupied the space between house and nearby creek. Not grand by Eastern standards, certainly, but far more established than Hannah had envisioned. This wasn't a crude settler's cabin, but a working ranch built with planning and foresight. "Home," Caleb said simply, as he guided the wagon into the yard. A man emerged from the barn as they approached, tall and lanky, with graying hair beneath. A battered hat. He raised a hand in greeting, his weathered face curious as he noted Hannah's presence beside Caleb. "Jim Parker," Caleb explained as he halted the wagon. "My foreman." Parker approached, removing his hat as he neared Hannah. "Ma'am," he greeted, his manner respectful despite obvious curiosity. "Welcome to Thornton Ranch." "Jim, this is Miss Hannah Wilson," Caleb introduced. "She'll be managing the household from now on." If Parker was surprised by this development, he masked it well. "Pleased to meet you, Miss Wilson. About time this place had a woman's touch." Hannah acknowledged the greeting with a nod, experiencing the familiar discomfort that accompanied new introductions, though Parker's straightforward manner eased her anxiety somewhat. "Everything ran smoothly while I was gone?" Caleb asked, climbing down from the wagon. "Smooth as can be expected with 20 new lambs in 3 days," Parker replied, a hint of dry humor in his tone. "South Range is doing well, though we lost on you to a mountain lion, found tracks yesterday morning." Caleb's expression darkened slightly at this news. "Same one from last month?" "Can't say for certain, but the tracks looked similar in size. Tyler's watching that section with the rifle tonight." Hannah listened to this exchange with increasing awareness of the ranch's realities. Mountain lions, overnight guards with rifles, constant vigilance against predators. These dangers existed far beyond her Connecticut experience. The protected world of Millbrook Library, with its greatest threats being overdue books or water-damaged bindings, seemed impossibly distant. As the men continued discussing ranch matters, Hannah remained seated on the wagon, observing her new surroundings with careful attention. A movement at the main house caught her eye. A curtain in an upstairs window, shifting slightly, then falling back into place. She wondered if the house contained occupants she hadn't been told about, then dismissed the thought. Likely just a draft disturbing fabric in an unoccupied room. Eventually, Caleb returned his attention to Hannah. "Let's get you settled," he said, offering a hand to help her down from the wagon. "Jim can bring your trunks in later." The main house proved even more substantial inside than its exterior had suggested. The front door opened into a large common room combining parlor and dining area, with a massive stone fireplace dominating. One wall, sturdy furniture, a long table with benches, several chairs, and a cushioned settee occupied the space in practical arrangement. Surprisingly, good quality braided rugs softened the wide plank floors, while glass-fronted cabinets displayed dishes and cooking implements along another wall. "Kitchen's through there," Caleb said, gesturing toward a doorway. "Bedrooms upstairs, root cellar and pantry below." He led Hannah through the house with efficient steps, pointing out essential features: the pump at the kitchen sink that drew water from a nearby well, the wood-burning cook stove with its warming shelves, the back entrance leading to the garden and clotheslines. Upstairs, a central hallway connected 4 bedrooms. "Mine's at the end," Caleb explained, indicating the rear-facing room. "Yours will be this one." He opened a door to reveal a pleasant chamber overlooking the garden and creek beyond. The room contained a single bed with a simple iron frame, a dresser with attached mirror, a small writing desk beneath the window, and a colourful quilt that added unexpected warmth to the practical furnishings. A braided rug, similar to those downstairs, covered most of the plank floor, while white curtains framed the window. "Not fancy," Caleb said, echoing his earlier description. "But comfortable, I hope." "It's lovely," Hannah replied softly, surprising herself with the genuine response. After weeks of uncertainty and temporary accommodation, the prospect of a space truly her own, even in this remote location, provided unexpected comfort. "Bathrooms at the end of the hall," Caleb continued, "more modern than you might expect. Had a proper boiler installed last year, so hot water doesn't require hauling buckets from the kitchen stove." This level of convenience surprised Hannah, suggesting investment beyond mere necessity. Clearly, Thornton Ranch had prospered under Caleb's management, allowing improvements many frontier households lacked. "I mentioned a library," Caleb added, leading her back into the hallway and opening another door. "It's small, but might interest you." The room revealed was indeed compact, perhaps 8 feet square, but lined with bookshelves on 3 walls. Unlike the haphazard collection Hannah had organized in Pine Creek, these volumes showed evidence of careful selection. Reference works on animal husbandry and agriculture, histories of Western exploration, bound volumes of territorial records, even some classic literature. "My father was an educated man," Caleb explained, noting Hannah's surprise. "Believed knowledge was as essential as practical skills. Most of these were his, brought west when I established the ranch." This glimpse into Caleb's background, the first personal information he had volunteered, shifted Hannah's perception slightly. The rugged sheep rancher, with his direct manner and work-hardened hands, contained unexpected complexity. As they returned downstairs, Hannah gathered courage to ask about the curtain movement she had observed earlier. "Is there someone else in the house? I thought I saw movement at an upstairs window when we arrived." Caleb paused on the stairs, his expression unreadable. "That would be Sarah," he said after a moment. "I should have mentioned her earlier." Hannah felt a flicker of unease. Who was Sarah, and why had Caleb omitted her from his detailed description of the household? "Sarah's my sister," he continued as they reached the main floor. "She's been unwell for some time. Lives here, but keeps mostly to her room. You'll likely see little of her, at least initially." This unexpected revelation raised immediate questions in Hannah's mind, none of which seemed appropriate to ask directly. An invalid sister, never mentioned in their previous discussions, represented a significant addition to Hannah's understanding of the household she would manage. "Will she require specific care?" Hannah asked, focusing on practical considerations. "She manages her own needs mostly," Caleb replied, his tone suggesting reluctance to elaborate. "Takes meals in her room. Mrs. Carson, neighbor's wife, has been coming twice weekly to check on her and help with household matters. She'll continue that arrangement for now." Hannah nodded, absorbing this information while wondering what ailment kept Sarah Thornton confined to her room. Physical disability, chronic illness, or perhaps something of a more delicate nature, mental distress or emotional fragility. Such conditions were often handled with discretion in Millbrook, patients kept from public view to avoid uncomfortable questions. "I'd like to meet her when appropriate," Hannah said carefully. "If I manage the household properly." Caleb's expression softened slightly. "Of course, when she's feeling stronger. Sarah has good days and difficult ones. Today the journey's noise likely disturbed her. She's sensitive to changes in routine." Before Hannah could respond, the front door opened and Jim Parker entered, carrying one of her trunks. "Where would you like this, Miss Wilson?" The practical question redirected their attention, and the moment for further discussion of Sarah Thornton passed. Caleb helped Jim bring Hannah's remaining luggage upstairs, then excused himself to check on ranch matters that had accumulated during his absence. "Make yourself at home," he said as he prepared to leave. "Kitchen stocked with basics. Mrs. Carson left stew in the cooler this morning. Just needs heating for supper. I usually eat around 7, but don't wait if you're hungry earlier." Left alone in the house, Hannah took time to explore her new domain more thoroughly. The kitchen proved well equipped with quality utensils, cooking implements, and a better selection of staples than she had anticipated. The pantry contained preserved foods, canned vegetables, fruits and meats, organized with surprising care, while the root cellar yielded potatoes, onions and apples stored from the previous season. As promised, a covered pot in the cooler contained beef stew, its ingredients still identifiable despite having been thoroughly cooked: chunks of meat, carrots, potatoes and onions in thick gravy. Hannah sampled a small spoonful, finding it adequately seasoned, if somewhat bland by her standards. She made a mental note to inquire about available herbs and spices as she established her own cooking routine. Returning upstairs, Hannah unpacked her belongings with methodical precision, arranging clothes in the dresser drawers and placing her mother's hand mirror on top with her hairbrush and comb. Her small collection of books went to the writing desk, along with paper, pens, and the journal where she had documented her journey west. These familiar objects in new surroundings provided anchor points, reminding her of continuity despite dramatic changes in circumstance. As Hannah organized her room, she found herself listening for any sound that might indicate Sarah Thornton's presence in the adjacent chamber. Occasionally, she thought she detected movement, a floorboard's creak, the soft scrape of furniture, but nothing definitive enough to confirm the other woman was indeed there. The mystery of Caleb's sister added a layer of complexity to Hannah's new situation. What responsibility would she bear for this unseen household member? How might Sarah's presence affect the careful boundaries Hannah had established in her employment arrangement with Caleb? By early evening, Hannah had completed her unpacking and familiarized herself with the house's essential features. She returned to the kitchen to heat the stew Mrs. Carson had prepared, added fresh biscuits using ingredients from the well-stocked pantry, and set the table for supper. Caleb returned promptly at 7, washing at the pump outside the back door before entering the kitchen. He paused in the doorway, surveying the domestic scene Hannah had created: table set with actual napkins unearthed from a drawer, stew steaming in a serving bowl rather than eaten directly from the cooking pot, fresh biscuits arranged on a plate she had found in the glass-fronted cabinet. "You've been busy," he observed, genuine appreciation evident in his tone. "Just basic preparations," Hannah replied. "I'll need time to establish proper routines." Caleb nodded, seeming to understand her need to define expectations. "Of course, no rush. We've managed this along with makeshift arrangements." They seated themselves at the table, an awkward moment arising as both realized this was their first meal together as employer and employee rather than traveling companions. Caleb solved the dilemma by serving himself stew without ceremony, then passing the bowl to Hannah. "Mrs. Carson's a decent cook," he commented between bites, "though limited in her repertoire. These biscuits are an improvement over what we usually manage." Hannah acknowledged the compliment with a slight nod, her natural reserve reasserting itself in this unfamiliar domestic arrangement. They ate in relative silence, broken occasionally by Caleb's brief comments about ranch conditions or Hannah's quiet questions about household supplies. As they finished eating, Caleb rose to help clear the table, a gesture that surprised Hannah. Given her understanding of frontier gender roles, "You needn't do that," she said. "It's my responsibility now." "Force of habit," he replied, continuing to gather dishes. "Been managing for myself for a long while." Besides, it seems unfair for you to handle everything on your first day here. This considerate response further complicated Hannah's impression of Caleb Thornton. The man who had first appeared in Pine Creek with news of Ezra's arrest had seemed direct to the point of bluntness, his manner suggesting little capacity for social niceties. Yet here he demonstrated unexpected thoughtfulness, an awareness of fairness that transcended conventional arrangements between employer and domestic help. As they worked together washing and drying dishes, another surprise, as Hannah had expected. To complete this task alone, Caleb spoke of practical matters regarding the ranch's schedule. "I'm usually out at dawn," he explained. "Sometimes earlier during lambing season. Simple breakfast is all that's needed. Jim and any hands eat at the bunkhouse. You won't need to cook for them. Midday meal I handle myself, usually just bread. And jerky while working. Supper around 7 as today." Hannah listened attentively, mentally organizing these expectations into a workable routine. "And Sarah, when does she prefer her meals?" Caleb's hands stilled briefly before resuming their work. "Breakfast around 8 usually, lunch at noon, early supper, 5 or so. She'll let you know if she needs anything different." "Does she have food preferences I should be aware of?" Hannah pressed gently, seeking practical information to guide her work. "Nothing specific," Caleb replied, "though she favors sweets when available. Mrs. Carson usually leaves cookies or cake for her." When the kitchen was restored to order, Caleb paused awkwardly near the doorway. "I usually spend evenings in the library," he said, "reading or handling correspondence. You're welcome to use the common room for whatever you'd like. There's a small collection of needlework supplies in the cabinet beneath the window. Martha mentioned you enjoy sewing. This thoughtful provision, needlework supplies acquired specifically, with her preferences in mind, caught Hannah by surprise. When had Martha discussed such details with Caleb, and how had he managed to obtain appropriate materials in the brief time between their arrangement and departure from Pine Creek? "Thank you," she said softly. "Though I brought some projects of my own," Caleb nodded. "Well then, good night, Miss Wilson. If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask." After he departed for the library, Hannah remained in the kitchen, absorbing the day's experiences. In the span of hours, she had traveled from Pine Creek's small community to this isolated ranch, established herself in a new household, and encountered the mystery of Sarah Thornton, all while navigating the complex dynamics of her relationship with Caleb himself. As she prepared for bed that night in her new room, Hannah heard soft movement from the chamber across the hall. Sarah's room, according to the house layout Caleb had shown her. The sounds were faint but unmistakable, footsteps crossing floorboards, the gentle closing of what might be a wardrobe door, the creak of bed springs as someone settled for the night. Hannah paused in brushing her hair, listening intently. These mundane noises represented her first concrete evidence of Sarah Thornton's existence beyond Caleb's brief explanation. Tomorrow, perhaps, she would learn more about this mysterious woman whose presence added an unexpected dimension to Hannah's new position. Settling beneath the colorful quilt on her bed, Hannah reviewed her situation with characteristic thoroughness. The position offered a practical solution to her immediate needs: shelter, purpose, income. Caleb had proven fair-minded and more considerate than his rugged exterior suggested. The ranch itself exceeded her expectations in terms of amenities and organization, yet questions remained, hovering at the edges of her ordered thoughts. What circumstances had brought Sarah Thornton to her secluded existence? What dynamics existed between the siblings that Caleb had chosen not to explain? And most persistent of all, what place might Hannah Wilson, once intended as Ezra Montgomery's mail-order bride, ultimately find in this unexpected household? As sleep claimed her, Hannah's last awareness was of wind sighing through pine trees outside her window and the distant plaintive call of a coyote somewhere in the vast wilderness surrounding Thornton Ranch, reminders that her new home existed. On the frontier in more ways than one, the seasons turned at Thornton Ranch, summer's lush abundance yielding to autumn's golden hues, then to winter's crystalline beauty. Hannah marked 6 months of residence with quiet reflection one snowy December evening, marveling at how completely her life had transformed since leaving Connecticut. The household had settled into comfortable rhythms under her management. Meals appeared at their appointed times, laundry hung crisp and clean on lines when weather permitted or dried before the kitchen stove when snow fell. The pantry remained well stocked, floors gleamed with regular attention, and even the ranch's accounts, once a chaotic collection of receipts and hastily scribbled notes, now occupied orderly ledgers with Hannah's precise handwriting marking. Every transaction, most surprising was her relationship with Sarah Thornton. After 3 weeks of meals delivered outside a closed door and brief, impersonal notes requesting specific items, Caleb's sister had finally emerged from seclusion, tentatively at first, venturing downstairs only when assured the ranch hands were absent, and then with growing confidence, as Hannah proved consistently gentle in her approach. Sarah was 36, 4 years younger than her brother, with the same striking blue eyes, but none of his weathered sturdiness. Slender to the point of fragility, she moved through the house like a shadow, her voice rarely rising above a whisper. The mysterious ailment that kept her confined, Hannah gradually discovered, was not physical but emotional, the aftermath of a brutal attack during the early years of the ranch's establishment when Caleb had been away delivering wool to Helena markets. 3 men, Sarah had confided during a rare moment of openness, her thin fingers pleating and unpleasing her apron as she spoke. Though the ranch was undefended, weren't expecting a woman with a shotgun. She had indeed defended herself, killing one intruder and wounding another before the third fled. But the trauma had shattered something essential in her spirit. By the time Caleb returned 4 days later, Sarah had retreated into a silence so profound that local physicians pronounced her afflicted with hysteria and recommended institutionalization, a fate Caleb had flatly rejected. "She's not broken," he had told Hannah gruffly when finally explaining the situation. "Just found a different way to navigate the world after what happened. Most folks can't understand that." But Hannah, familiar with the comfort of silence and the challenge of finding one's voice in a world that demanded constant expression, understood better than most. She approached Sarah with patient acceptance, allowing the other woman to set the pace of their interactions, never pushing for more conversation or engagement than freely offered. "You don't stare at me like I'm damaged," Sarah had observed one afternoon as they shelled peas together by the kitchen fire. "Or talk extra loud like I've gone deaf along with quiet." "Different isn't damaged," Hannah had replied simply. This straightforward acceptance had gradually established trust between them. Now, 6 months into Hannah's residence, Sarah regularly joined her for household tasks, baking bread, preserving garden harvests, even occasionally helping with laundry when her strength permitted. She rarely left the ranch house and still retreated to her room during visits from neighbors or ranch hands. But within the household's private spaces, she had become a quiet but present participant. Hannah's relationship with Caleb had evolved, with similar gradual certainty. Their initial formality, his careful maintenance of employer-employee boundaries, her reserved professionalism, had gradually softened into something more comfortable, if still undefined. Conversations that once focused exclusively on practical matters now occasionally ventured into personal territory, particularly during long winter evenings when darkness fell early and outdoor work concluded sooner. Hannah learned about Caleb's childhood in Pennsylvania, where his father's small sheep farm had provided modest but stable living until both parents died of influenza within weeks of each other. At 22, Caleb had sold the family property, used the proceeds to purchase his initial flock, and headed west with 18-year-old Sarah to build something of their own in Montana Territory. "Wasn't easy those first years," he told Hannah, as they sat before the fire one February evening, snow falling silently beyond frosted windows. "Lived in a one-room cabin with a leaky roof. Lost almost a third of the flock that first winter to wolves and weather. Sarah kept our spirits up then. Funny to remember now, but she was the talkative one, always telling stories, making plans for the fine house we'd build someday." His expression had grown distant, remembering the sister who existed before trauma, redefined her. "Sometimes I wonder if Sarah is still there somewhere, just waiting for the world to feel safe again." Hannah had shared her own history as well, her mother's struggles as a widow managing the Millbrook Library, her father's death in the war between the states when Hannah was just 8 years old, her gradual retreat into silence as childhood. Shyness hardened into habitual reserve under the pressure of community expectations. "I spoke quite normally until about 10, she explained during one such conversation. "Then I found it increasingly difficult to offer opinions when others seemed so certain of theirs. Eventually, it became easier to listen than to compete for attention." "Their loss," Caleb had commented, surprising her with the simple assessment. "Some of the most worthwhile things get said when someone takes time to find the right words." Such moments of connection accumulated gradually like snowflakes, building into drifts, individually small but collectively substantial. Hannah found herself noting the exact shade of blue in Caleb's eyes when firelight struck them at certain angles, the way his hands moved with unexpected gentleness when handling newborn lambs, the rare but transformative quality of his full smile when something genuinely amused him. For his part, Caleb seemed increasingly attentive to Hannah's presence, ensuring the library contained lamps with good wicks for her evening reading, bringing back small items from supply trips to Pine Creek that showed careful observation of her preferences, adjusting ranch schedules to accommodate her household routines rather than expecting the reverse. These subtle shifts occurred against the backdrop of Montana's dramatic seasons. Hannah experienced her first high-country summer with its intense sun and afternoon thunderstorms that rolled across the valley like celestial warfare. She helped harvest the substantial garden, learning preservation techniques from both Sarah and Mrs. Carson, whose twice-weekly visits continued, though, with diminishing necessity as Hannah mastered the household's management. Autumn brought spectacular color to Willow Creek Valley, followed by the ranch's busiest period as sheep were moved to winter pastures and preparations made for Montana's legendary cold. Hannah witnessed her first snowfall in October, just a dusting that melted by midday, but herald of the serious winter to come. By December, snow lay deep across the valley, transforming familiar landmarks into mysterious shapes mounded with white. The creek froze solid enough to walk across, and Hannah learned to navigate snowdrifts between house and outbuildings to judge which days permitted travel and which required remaining safely at the ranch, to appreciate the profound silence of snowbound mornings when sound itself seemed crystallized by cold. Throughout these transitions, letters arrived periodically from Pine Creek, Martha Blackwood's newsy accounts of settlement developments, Patrick Donovan's updates about the library she had established, and occasionally official communications regarding Ezra Montgomery's ongoing legal troubles. The latter confirmed what Hannah had already suspected. Ezra would likely spend years addressing charges of criminal negligence and financial impropriety. His property had been seized to compensate victims' families, his reputation irreparably damaged. What might have been Hannah's life had become a cautionary tale, a path not taken that she reviewed with increasing detachment. One snowy afternoon, in early January, Caleb returned from a rare winter trip to Pine Creek with more than the usual supplies. After unloading essential provisions in the kitchen, he retrieved a small package from inside his coat. "Special delivery," he said, handing it to Hannah. "Came all the way from Connecticut." The return address, written in familiar, neat script, belonged to Reverend Blackwell in Millbrook. Hannah opened the package with careful fingers to find a letter accompanied by a small, hinged box. "My dear Hannah," the letter began, "your correspondence these past months has given me much pleasure, particularly witnessing your growing contentment. In Montana Territory, what began as necessity appears to have become purpose, and perhaps even happiness. I write now with news that might interest you. The library board, facing difficulty finding a suitable replacement after your departure, has experienced significant regret regarding their hasty decision. The Hartford librarian they eventually hired remained only 2 months before departing for a more urban position. Your organized systems, however, continue to serve the community well in her absence. More relevantly to your current circumstances, I have recently received communication from your mother's cousin, Edward Wilson, who has been located in Boston after considerable effort. Upon learning of your situation, he was distressed to discover family connection had been lost following your mother's passing. The enclosed item belonged to your grandmother Wilson and was intended for you upon your marriage. Edward felt strongly it should be forwarded without further delay. I pray this finds you well and content in your new life. Know that you are remembered with fondness by those in Millbrook whose opinions are worth valuing. With sincere regards, Thomas Blackwell." Hannah opened the small box to find a delicate gold locket containing a miniature portrait of a woman whose features suggested family resemblance, her grandmother Wilson, whom she had never known. The reverse side bore a simple inscription, "Faith in silence, strength in gentleness." "Good news?" Caleb asked, noting her prolonged attention to the items. "Family. Connection," Hannah replied softly. "One I didn't know remained." She showed him the locket and its inscription, which he read with careful attention. "Suits you," he observed, returning it to her hands. "Both qualities I've noticed since you arrived." The simple acknowledgement, delivered without embellishment or qualification, warmed Hannah more than the kitchen's crackling fire. How different from Millbrook's assessment of her reserved nature as deficiency rather than character. That evening after supper, as Hannah and Sarah worked together on mending while Caleb reviewed breeding records for the spring lambing season, an unexpected knock interrupted their quiet domestic scene. Visitors were rare during winter, particularly after dark, when travel through snow-covered landscape became treacherous. Caleb rose immediately, hand moving instinctively toward the rifle mounted above the fireplace, before he caught himself. Sarah, predictably, slipped from the room toward the back stairs, unwilling to face unexpected company. "Stay here," Caleb instructed Hannah, his expression concerned as he moved toward the door. Hannah nodded, setting aside her mending but remaining alert. Montana Territory, for all its beauty, contained dangers both natural and human. Travelers seeking shelter during winter storms were generally welcomed, but caution remained prudent. Voices at the door, Caleb's deep tones joined by another male's unfamiliar speech, carried indistinctly to where Hannah waited. After several minutes, Caleb returned to the common room, accompanied by a stranger whose trail-worn appearance suggested a difficult journey. "Hannah," Caleb said, his formal use of her first name marking the situation's seriousness, "this is Marshal Thomas Reed from the Territorial Office. He's come with news about Ezra Montgomery." Hannah set her sewing aside completely, rising to acknowledge the lawman with appropriate courtesy. "Marshal, you've traveled far in difficult conditions." Reed nodded, removing his hat to reveal graying hair and a weathered face that had seen its share of frontier hardships. "Wouldn't have attempted it if the matter weren't urgent, ma'am." Stopped. At the Blackwoods in Pine Creek, and they directed me here. Please sit, Hannah offered, indicating the chair Sarah had vacated. You must be cold after such a journey. As the marshal settled himself near the fire, Caleb disappeared briefly to the kitchen, returning with coffee strong enough to revive even the most trail-weary traveler. When all were seated with steaming cups, Reed delivered his news directly. Ezra, Montgomery escaped custody 3 days ago while being transported from Butte to Helena for court proceedings. Killed a guard in the process. Hannah felt the information land like physical weight, though her expression remained composed. I see. Ordinarily, I wouldn't trouble civilians with such matters, Reed continued. But circumstances suggest cause. For concern, Montgomery obtained a horse and supplies and was reportedly heading northwest, this general direction, before tracks were lost in recent snowfall. Caleb's expression darkened. You think he's coming here? For what purpose? Before escaping, he made several statements to fellow prisoners indicating resentment toward his former fiancée. Reed replied, his gaze shifting apologetically toward Hannah. Blamed her for abandoning him in his time of need, as he put it. One witness reported he specifically mentioned finding her at the sheep ranch where she took refuge, the implications clarified with terrible precision. Ezra, armed and desperate after killing once already, potentially sought Hannah at Thornton Ranch, a location known in Pine Creek through her correspondence with the Blackwoods and Patrick Donovan. We have men searching, Reed assured them, but the territory's vast and winter conditions complicate tracking. Thought you deserved warning, especially isolated as you are here. Appreciated, Caleb said grimly. We'll take precautions. After the marshal departed, declining offers to remain overnight in favor of returning to his men camped closer to Pine Creek, Caleb secured the house with methodical thoroughness, checking window latches, barring doors, bringing additional firearms from his room to strategic locations downstairs. Jim and Tyler will take watch rotations at the bunkhouse, he informed Hannah, after returning from informing his ranch hands of the situation. Property's too large to secure completely, but we can monitor approach routes. Hannah nodded, her practical nature asserting itself despite the troubling news. Should I inform Sarah? Caleb considered briefly. Yes, though carefully. She doesn't need details about Montgomery's crimes, just awareness that we're taking security precautions due to reports of an escaped prisoner in the region. Later, after sharing a modified version of the situation with Sarah, Hannah found herself unable to sleep, despite physical exhaustion. She stood at her bedroom window, gazing out, at moonlight reflecting brilliantly off the snow-covered landscape. Somewhere in that vast wilderness, Ezra Montgomery might be traveling toward her, carrying resentment transformed into dangerous intent. The realization should have terrified her, yet Hannah felt strangely calm. The woman who had left Millbrook, shy, uncertain, defined by others' assessment of her quiet nature as deficiency, had discovered unexpected strength during her Montana months. This Hannah had survived transcontinental journey, professional disappointment, broken engagement, and the challenge of establishing herself in frontier conditions. A soft knock interrupted her contemplation. Opening her door, she found Caleb, standing in the hallway, his expression troubled in the dim light of the oil lamp he carried. Couldn't sleep, he explained simply. Thought you might be equally restless. Hannah nodded, acknowledging shared concern without need for elaborate expression. Would you join me downstairs? Caleb asked. Coffee's hot, and I find night watches pass easier with company. In the kitchen, they sat at the table where countless meals had been shared over the past months. Lamplight created a small circle of warmth against the pressing darkness beyond frost-covered windows. Outside, wind whispered through pine branches, the only sound disturbing the profound silence of snow-blanketed night. I'm sorry, Caleb said finally, breaking their companionable quiet, that Montgomery's actions have followed you here. This should have been a safe place. It remains so, Hannah replied with soft certainty. Whatever happens. Caleb studied her across the table, his clear blue eyes reflecting both concern and something deeper, more difficult to define. You've changed since arriving, he observed. Not fundamentally, your nature remains the same, but there's confidence now alongside the quietness. Hannah considered this assessment, recognizing its accuracy. Perhaps I needed the right environment to discover what already existed, she suggested, like plants that only flower under specific conditions. Thornton Ranch has certainly bloomed under your care, Caleb said, a hint of his rare smile appearing. Briefly, Sarah engages more each month, the house transformed from mere shelter to a genuine home. Even the account books make sense for the first time since I established this place. His appreciation, offered without qualification or expectation, warmed Hannah more thoroughly than the coffee she sipped. How different from Millbrook's conditional acceptance, always shadowed by assessment of what she lacked rather than what she contributed. Our arrangement was to continue through winter, Caleb continued, his tone shifting to something more careful. That season's halfway through now. Have you given thought to what comes after? The question caught Hannah by surprise, though in truth she had considered this matter regularly in recent weeks. The position as housekeeper had been presented as a temporary, practical solution to immediate need rather than permanent arrangement. Yet, as months passed, Thornton Ranch had become more than employment. It had become home. I have, she acknowledged, meeting his gaze directly despite her naturally reserved manner. Though I've reached no firm conclusion, Caleb nodded, seeming to choose his next words with unusual care. I hoped. That is, I wondered if you might consider a more permanent arrangement. Hannah's breath caught slightly, uncertain of his precise meaning, yet unwilling to presume. When you arrived, Caleb continued, his deep voice pitched lower than usual, I saw someone who needed position and security, things I could provide practically as an employer. But as weeks passed, I began seeing you, Hannah, your quiet strength, your careful attention to what others overlook, your patience with Sarah when most would have demanded improvement or given up entirely. He paused, seeming to gather courage for what came next. I'm not a man given to poetic speech or grand gestures, but I know value when I see it, in livestock, or land, or people. What you bring to this ranch, to this home, goes beyond tasks completed or services rendered. Hannah sat very still, the implications of his words gradually crystallizing into unmistakable meaning. Are you offering continued employment? She asked softly, needing certainty before proceeding further. I'm offering partnership, Caleb replied, his directness returning now that the most difficult part had been expressed. Marriage, if you'd consider it, not from necessity or convenience, but because I believe we complement each other in ways that could build something worthwhile, something neither of us might achieve separately. The proposal, delivered without elaborate rhetoric yet with profound sincerity, resonated with Hannah's own practical nature. This was no romantic declaration from a storybook suitor, but something far more valuable, recognition of her worth. Exactly as she was, quiet nature included, rather than merely tolerated. You're not concerned my reserved manner would prove disadvantageous, she asked, the question emerging from lingering memory of Millbrook's assessment. Advantage, I'd say, Caleb responded without hesitation. You observe before speaking, consider before acting, listen before judging. Rare qualities in this territory, where too many rush headlong into decisions they later regret. His assessment, so different from those who had deemed her too shy throughout her eastern life, confirmed the transformation that had occurred since arriving in Montana. Here, her quiet nature found value rather than criticism, her careful ways appreciated rather than dismissed. I would need time, Hannah said finally, not to consider your worth, that's evident daily, but to be certain my acceptance comes from clear-eyed choice rather than practical necessity. Caleb nodded, no disappointment evident in his expression. Time is something Montana has in abundance, he replied. I've no interest in hasty decisions, only honest ones. The moment hung between them, filled with potential yet unrushed, much like their developing relationship over the preceding months. No dramatic declaration demanded immediate response, only straightforward recognition of possibility that had grown naturally from shared experience. Their conversation might have continued further had not a sound from beyond the house interrupted. Their private exchange, the distinctive crack of rifle fire, followed immediately by Jim Parker's voice calling urgent warning from the bunkhouse area. Someone's approaching from the north ridge, Caleb interpreted, instantly alert as he rose. From the table, stay inside, bar the door behind me. Before Hannah could respond, he had retrieved his rifle from its position near the back door and disappeared into the snowy darkness, moving with the sure-footed confidence of a man navigating familiar territory even in adverse conditions. Left alone in the kitchen's lamplight, Hannah moved with calm efficiency, born of both natural temperament and months of frontier adaptation. She secured the door as instructed, then proceeded through the house, ensuring all other entrances were similarly protected. Upstairs, she found Sarah already awake, her slight frame tense with anxiety as she huddled in her bedroom doorway. "Trouble?" she asked, her whispered question containing volumes of hard-earned wariness. "Precautionary measures," Hannah replied, her soft voice steady. "Caleb's investigating with Jim and Tyler." Rather than retreating further into her room, as might once have been her response, Sarah straightened her shoulders. "We should prepare. Downstairs. If there's confrontation, better to have supplies gathered." This unexpected resilience, Sarah moving toward potential danger rather than away from it, marked significant evolution in the woman who had spent years in self-imposed seclusion. Hannah nodded agreement, and together they descended to the kitchen where practical preparations might provide both necessary readiness and calming activity during uncertain waiting. As they assembled bandages, water, and essential provisions, Hannah reflected on the irony of their situation. Ezra Montgomery had traveled thousands of miles to claim a bride whose shy nature he had accepted via correspondence, but never truly valued. Now that same reserved woman had found genuine appreciation precisely because of the qualities Millbrook had deemed insufficient. Her careful observation, her measured responses, her thoughtful presence that brought peace to a household long. Deprived of feminine influence, the contrasts crystallized with perfect clarity. Ezra's desperation to possess what he had lost versus Caleb's patient recognition of worth freely given. Eastern society's dismissal of quiet strength versus frontier. Appreciation for substance over performance. The mail-order bride arrangement premised on necessity and convenience versus partnership offered on foundation of genuine understanding. Rifle fire shattered Hannah's reflections. 3 shots in rapid succession from alarmingly close to the house, followed by shouted commands in Caleb's distinctive voice. Sarah flinched at the noise, but continued her preparations, her thin hands steadier than might be expected given her history. Minutes stretched with excruciating slowness, punctuated by distant sounds of conflict, too indistinct to interpret clearly. Hannah moved to the front window, careful to remain hidden behind heavy curtains as she peered into moonlit darkness. Shadowy figures moved across the yard between house and outbuildings. 3 or 4 men, their identities indistinguishable. At this distance, when knocking finally came at the kitchen door, both women started despite anticipating some resolution. Hannah approached cautiously, Sarah positioning herself nearby with Caleb's spare shotgun held with surprising competence. "Hannah," "Sarah, it's me," Caleb's voice called through the heavy wood. "It's over, safe to open now." The door revealed Caleb, flanked by Jim Parker and Tyler Williams, all three men looking grimly triumphant despite the bitter cold and late hour. Behind them, a fourth figure lay motionless in the snow, unmistakably human but unidentifiable from the doorway. "Montgomery," Caleb confirmed, following Hannah's gaze, "tried approaching from the ridge behind the barn." Jim spotted him before he got within proper firing range of the house. "Is he?" Hannah left the question unfinished. "Wounded, not killed," Jim supplied. "Shot hit his shoulder when he returned fire. Lost considerable blood before we secured him." "Marshal Reed's men are camped at Carson's property," Caleb added. "Tyler's riding there now to bring them here. Montgomery will face justice properly, though with additional charges now." The practical resolution: Ezra captured alive to face legal consequences rather than killed in frontier-style retribution, reflected Caleb's fundamental character. Even protecting his household, he had chosen measured response over excessive force when options existed. As Jim and Tyler handled the immediate security concerns, Caleb remained with Hannah and Sarah in the kitchen's warm sanctuary. His expression as he looked at Hannah contained questions beyond the immediate crisis, reminder of conversation interrupted by Ezra's ill-fated arrival, of proposition offered and answer still pending. Sarah, displaying unexpected perceptiveness, quietly excused herself to gather additional supplies for the wounded prisoner, leaving them momentarily alone. "You asked for time," Caleb said simply. "That remains yours to take, regardless of tonight's events." Hannah considered his words, recognizing the respect they contained for her autonomy, her right to consider decision rather than emotional response to danger narrowly averted. This respect, for her process as much as her person, confirmed what months of observation had suggested. "I don't require more time," she replied, her quiet voice carrying certainty that needed no additional volume. "Tonight merely confirmed what I already knew. My place is here, not as an employee but as a partner, as a wife, if that remains. Your wish," the transformation that swept across Caleb's features, tension yielding to profound relief, then to something approaching joy despite his typically reserved demeanor, provided answers beyond words. When he reached for her hands, Hannah offered them without hesitation, the physical connection simple yet significant between two people whose natural reticence made such gestures meaningful. "It does," he confirmed. Now more than ever, no elaborate declarations followed, no dramatic embraces or passionate avowals. Such demonstrations would have been foreign to both their natures. Instead, they stood together in the kitchen's warmth, hands joined in tacit acknowledgement of foundation already established through months of observation, appreciation, and growing understanding. Outside, Marshal Reed's approaching men would soon secure Ezra Montgomery for return to justice. Sarah would continue her gradual emergence from trauma's shadow, encouraged by Hannah's patient acceptance. Spring would eventually release the valley from winter's grip, bringing new lambs, garden plantings, and community connections renewed through seasonal accessibility. But at this moment, Hannah Wilson, once deemed too shy for Millbrook, Connecticut, rejected upon arrival in Montana territory, yet ultimately valued for the very qualities others had dismissed, found perfect confirmation of her grandmother's locket inscription: faith in silence, strength in gentleness. The quiet librarian's daughter had traveled west seeking security, but discovered something far more precious: appreciation for her authentic self. Partnership founded on genuine recognition of her worth, and home created through the steady application of her natural gifts rather than forced adaptation to others' expectations. Not everyone would understand the contentment Hannah found in this remote valley with its rugged rancher and his wounded sister, but for a woman who had spent her life speaking softly in a world that valued volume over substance, Caleb Thornton's straightforward recognition represented the truest form of love, not despite her reserved nature, but because of the depth it contained. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.